The ocean holds stories that never end. Wrecks without survivors, ships found adrift, and discoveries that science still can't explain. From vanished crews to strange objects found miles beneath the waves, these events remind us how little we truly know about the sea. What follows are 27 real cases where mystery still lingers, each one recorded, investigated, and yet never fully solved. The Mary Celeste, 1872 Atlantic. The morning of December 4th, 1872 brought calm seas and a thin fog as the British brig DEI Greater crossed the Atlantic. Ahead, her lookout spotted another vessel drifting slowly under partial sail. There was no distress flag, no sign of life. As the ships drew closer, the name on the bow became visible, Mary Celeste. Captain David Morehouse ordered a boarding party. When his men climbed aboard, they stepped into silence. The sails fluttered loosely, the wheel turned freely, and the deck was empty. The ship was in working order, yet every soul aboard had vanished. The Mary Celeste had left New York less than a month earlier, on November 7th, 1872. Her destination was Genoa, Italy. At the helm was Captain Benjamin Spooner Briggs, a respected New England sailor known for his calm and discipline. Alongside him were his wife Sarah, their 2-year-old daughter Sophia, and a crew of 7. They carried 1,701 barrels of industrial alcohol, carefully sealed in the hold. It was a standard cargo on a familiar trade route. Nothing suggested trouble. The ship's log recorded strong winds and rough seas during the second week, but nothing beyond the ordinary for an Atlantic crossing. The final entry, written at 8 a.m. on November 25th, placed the Mary Celeste near the Azores. After that, the record ends. When the DEI Greater crew entered the cabins, they found the captain's quarters tidy, the family's clothes hanging neatly, and the child's toys in place. The galley was well stocked. There was food and fresh water for 6 months. The cargo below deck was intact except for 9 empty barrels, likely caused by natural leakage. About a metre of seawater sloshed in the hold, far from enough to threaten the vessel. The main hatch was secured, but 2 smaller hatches stood open. On deck lay a sounding rod, used to check water depth, as if dropped mid-task. One thing was missing: the ship's lifeboat. No evidence of fire, struggle or robbery appeared anywhere. The compass was broken, and some navigation instruments were gone, suggesting they might have been taken when the crew left. The Mary Celeste was then sailed to Gibraltar for an official investigation. The British Admiralty Court faced a puzzle without precedent. The ship was seaworthy, her cargo valuable, her crew experienced, and yet she had been abandoned. Rumours spread instantly: pirates, mutiny, insurance fraud, even murder. But the facts resisted all of them. There were no bloodstains, no damage, no stolen goods. The court eventually ruled that the vessel had been deserted for reasons unknown. Over time, investigators proposed many theories. One points to the cargo itself. The barrels of alcohol could have leaked fumes into the hold. If the crew smelled vapours or heard a muffled explosion, they might have feared the ship would blow up. To escape temporarily, they could have lowered the lifeboat and tethered it behind the vessel, planning to return once it was safe. A sudden gust or broken rope might have separated them forever. Another theory blames faulty instruments and bad weather. The pumps on board were found dismantled and clogged, possibly giving false readings that the ship was taking on dangerous amounts of water. Captain Briggs might have believed she was sinking and ordered everyone into the lifeboat. With shifting winds and rough waves, it could have drifted away before anyone realised the Mary Celeste was still sound. Some have suggested natural phenomena, waterspouts, sea quakes or rogue waves, that might have frightened or swept the crew away. None of these ideas, however, can explain why the ship remained in such stable condition afterward. No one ever found the lifeboat, the crew, or their remains. The Mary Celeste continued to sail for years after, but her name was never again spoken without a hint of unease. Despite decades of study, the case remains unsolved. The alcohol cargo theory fits some clues, but not all. The storm explanation seems plausible, yet lacks proof. The records of the Gibraltar court, the captain's last log entry, and the physical evidence each tell part of the story, but never the full one. What makes this mystery endure is its balance between logic and impossibility. A well-built ship, provisioned for months, left adrift under sail. A captain known for restraint, a family at his side, and a crew with no history of trouble, all gone in the middle of the ocean, leaving everything behind. The sea keeps many secrets, but few are as haunting as this. A floating home turned ghost ship, a voyage that never truly ended. The Mary Celeste still drifts through history, her sails empty, her story half-written, and her silence louder than any storm. Carroll A. Deering, 1921, Diamond Shoals. On a cold January morning in 1921, a 5-masted schooner lay stranded in the mist off the coast of North Carolina, her sails full yet motionless, her decks deserted. That ship was the Carroll A. Deering, built just 2 years prior, a grand last of the tall ship's cargo vessel, now aground on the infamous Diamond Shoals, and her crew had simply vanished. The Deering had been launched in Bath, Maine in 1919 by the G.G. Deering Company. She measured nearly 255 feet in length, carried 5 towering masts, and was built during an era when sail was already giving way to steam. She functioned as a coal carrier, setting out on her final voyage in the summer of 1920 when she loaded coal at Newport News, Virginia, bound for Rio de Janeiro. On the return leg she made stops, picked up provisions and sailed north. The ship seemed to be performing normally until the final passages along the US East Coast. On January 28 or 29, 1921, the Deering passed the Cape Lookout lightship off North Carolina. A man aboard hailed the lightship by megaphone, saying they had lost both anchors in a storm and requesting the company be notified. The lightship's captain later recorded that the voice sounded foreign, the speaker tall and thin, and observed that crew members seemed wandering uncontrolled on deck, an odd state of affairs for a seasoned sailing vessel. Shortly after that, the Deering moved on toward Diamond Shoals. Then came January 31st. A lookout at the Hatteras Inlet station spotted the schooner aground on the unravelling sands of Diamond Shoals. The Outer Banks offshore shelf, the shoals extend like a trap. The winds were howling, seas were heavy. Though the sails were set and the hull intact, her lifeboats were missing, her wheels shattered, her rudder detached, her logbook and navigation instruments gone. No one was on deck. No one answered calls, no distress signals had flown. Rescue boats could not approach closer than a quarter-mile due to the surf. After several days, the Coast Guard boarded the ship and confirmed the vessel was deserted. 3 starving cats were found on board, and that was it. Inside the Deering, they found the galley in mid-preparation. Supper cold on the stove, water for the next meal laid out. The 2 small lifeboats were gone, the main anchors missing, a ladder hung over the side as though some hurried descent had taken place. The red lights of Not Under Command sat on the main mast, a maritime signal that the ship was itself helpless. But if the vessel was unable to steer, why had the crew left? If they abandoned her, why did she continue on? Run aground fully under sail? The facts collided in contradiction. The Deering's discovery triggered one of the largest US investigations of its kind. The Coast Guard, the Justice Department, the Shipping Board all examined the case. Several hundred pages of testimony followed. Investigators inspected the ship's fittings, charted weather records, and considered human motives. One key factor, the storm just days before had been unusually violent for the area, winds of 70+ knots recorded at the nearby lightship. It may have battered the Deering, caused damage to her steering, perhaps prompted panic. The message about lost anchors supports this, but if the ship lost anchors and steering, the abandonment of 2 lifeboats still raises questions. A captain seasoned in sailing would likely ride out such a predicament, rather than launch into the icy surf in small boats. Another thread. Could mutiny or piracy have occurred? The sudden breakdown of discipline noted by the lightship crew, the missing navigation gear, the odd megaphone call, all hint at disorder. The Deering's first officer had reportedly clashed with the captain earlier in the voyage. But piracy off the US East Coast in 1921? The ship had no cargo at the time she went missing. She was in ballast, making lucrative piracy unlikely. Voluntary crew takeover seems unlikely given the risk and lack of reward. Yet the mystery persists. Some researchers argue that the crew may have abandoned ship out of fear, steering lost, anchors gone, heavy seas rolling. But once the lifeboats were launched, they perished or were separated from the ship, while the Deering, thrown by waves and wind, drifted, ran aground and sat there. But even this scenario fails to explain why halfway through all this, a fully rigged ship with no crew would remain upright and partially under sail rather than immediately foundered. In the months following the grounding, pieces of the Deering washed ashore on Ocracoke Island and Hatteras Island. Her bell, timbers, fittings. Local residents salvaged what they could and auctioned them. The official salvage effort was limited, wrecked wood sodden embedded deep in shifting sands. Yet the Coast Guard's report left open the dominant question, where is the crew? Because no abandoned lifeboats were recovered, no bodies were found, no logbook or charts remained on board, no sign of sea battle, no explosion, no identifiable sabotage. The greatest strength of the Carroll A Deering mystery lies in what was found and what was not. The schooner remains a symbol of the sea's capacity for vanishing acts. Her sails, once full of wind and life, now stand frozen in the memory of the shoals. The story of her crew disappears into freezing waters, drifting into silence. MV Joyita, 1955, South Pacific. A cool October dawn broke over Apia Harbour, Samoa, on the 3rd of October 1955, when the little wooden trading ship Joyita slipped her moorings and set off for the Tokelau Islands. On board, 16 crew members and 9 passengers, a doctor bound for surgery, a copra buyer, families, and a handful of island workers. The sea was calm, the voyage expected to take roughly 41 to 48 hours. At the helm was Captain Thomas H. Dusty Miller, a veteran sailor. The voyage should have been routine, the sort of inter-island hop common in those days, but trouble started almost immediately. The port engine clutch had failed, delaying the ship's departure by a day. She left harbour running on one engine, a warning flag few heeded. The vessel itself had seen better days, built in 1931 for the wealthy. Later used in World War II, she had been converted to cargo trade, fitted with cork-lined holds for refrigerated freight, and described as virtually unsinkable due to added buoyancy. Yet that very buoyancy may have helped turn the ship into something unrecognisable a few weeks later. After the journey began, radio contact faded. On the 6th of October, the ship was overdue. Despite aerial searches covering a wide area, no sign of Joyita or her people emerged. 5 weeks later, on the 10th of November, the merchant ship Tuvalu spotted her. Adrift, listing badly, about 600 miles off course, north of Vanuatu, Fiji. The hull was partially submerged, the decks awash, the radio strangely tuned to the International Distress Channel, yet no one was aboard. Boarding parties found a scene full of strange details. The Joyita's starboard engine was found covered by mattresses, the clutch on the port engine still partially disassembled, showing they had indeed departed port short-handed. The auxiliary pump in the engine room, mounted precariously on a plank between the main engines, remained disconnected. Bilge water sloshed in the lower decks. The radio set was tuned to 2182 kHz, but the cable to the antenna had been severed and then painted over, limiting its range to perhaps 2 miles. The logbook, sextant, chronometer, and navigation instruments were all gone. The 3 Kali life rafts the ship carried were missing. A doctor's bag was found on deck containing a stethoscope, scalpel, and 4 bandages stained with blood. The clocks aboard had stopped at 10:25 p.m. Lighting switches remained on, suggesting the calamity happened in the dark. Inquiry later found that the Joyita had begun flooding via a fractured cooling pipe in the engine room raw water circuit. The bilge pumps were clogged and ineffective. The ship lacked watertight compartments in the lower decks. As the flooding advanced, the ship lost speed, got beam onto heavy seas and began to list. Yet by design, the cork-lined hull and empty fuel drums gave the vessel strong buoyancy. She should not have sunk, and indeed she did not. She drifted instead. But here is the central mystery. With the vessel still afloat, why did the crew abandon ship? With bilge water rising, with engines failing, yes. But the Joyita should have been safe enough to remain aboard, especially given her buoyancy. Instead, the life rafts and dinghy were gone, the ship was left adrift, and no one ever returned. Investigators found the condition of the vessel puzzling. The hull intact, supplies aboard, no obvious explosion or battle damage, no sign of anyone fighting for survival on board. One hypothesis holds that the flooding triggered panic. With the engine failure, gearbox disassembly and auxiliary pump unused, the crew may have thought the ship was beyond saving. If the captain had been injured, bloodied bandages hint at this, the crew might have taken to the life rafts early, abandoning the vessel while she still floated, only to be lost at sea. Another suggests mutiny. Tension existed between Captain Miller and his first mate Charles Chuck Simpson. Perhaps a struggle injured the captain, control passed to the mate, and the abandonment followed. Still another proposes external forces, piracy, or a submarine encounter amid Cold War tensions. But the condition of the ship yielded no bullet holes, no boarding scars, nothing to prove violence. The formal inquiry held in Apia in February 1956 found that whilst the vessel was in poor repair, the fate of the 25 aboard was inexplicable on the evidence submitted. The missing life rafts remain a focal point of the mystery. If the crew went into rafts, where are they? If they did not, why leave a ship that was still afloat and relatively sound? The Joyita drifted into harbour at Suva under Tau. Even then, investigators heard water entering her hull. She was repaired and sailed again for some years, but the shadow of her 1955 voyage hung over her. She became linked forever to the pantheon of ghost ships. Sea stories of disappearances with no bodies, no final log entries, only an abandoned ship as evidence. The hull still afloat, the people gone, the questions unanswered. Kaz II, 2007, Great Barrier Reef. The sun was bright, the water calm, and the sea breeze gentle when the catamaran Kaz II left Airlie Beach on April 15, 2007. On board were 3 friends, skipper Derek Des Batten, age 56, and brothers Peter and James Tunstead, 69 and 63. They had planned a leisurely trip along the Queensland coast, sailing through the Great Barrier Reef before heading west toward Perth. None of them were seasoned ocean sailors, but they were careful, steady men, and the forecast promised smooth sailing. The Kaz II was a modern 10-metre catamaran. Sturdy and well-equipped, it had radios, GPS, food supplies, life jackets, and even a firearm for emergencies. The journey should have been simple, 2 days of travel to Townsville before continuing north. The boat departed on schedule, captured in a short home video showing the men smiling on deck, one of them fishing, the sea glistening around them. Then, silence. 3 days later, a Coastwatch aircraft spotted a white catamaran drifting aimlessly about 80 miles off the Queensland coast. From above, it looked in perfect condition, its sails half set and fluttering in the wind. No distress signals, no lifeboats, no one on deck. When authorities boarded the vessel on April 20th, the sight was deeply unsettling. The engine was still running. The laptop on the navigation table was open and working. The radio was tuned to the proper frequency. The table was neatly set for a meal, plates, cutlery, and an open bottle of beer. The cabin was tidy. The men's clothes were hanging dry. Life jackets and survival gear remained untouched. It looked as if the crew had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. The only signs of trouble were subtle. One sail was torn to shreds, as if caught by sudden wind. A fender hung from the railing, as though the crew had been preparing to dock or approach another vessel. The ship's GPS data showed that after leaving port, the Kaz II had followed a normal course, until around midday on April 15th, when the coordinates began to drift aimlessly. Investigators found no sign of foul play. The gun stored on board was untouched, and there were no signs of struggle. The logbook was missing, but the equipment was intact. Whatever had happened had come suddenly, without warning. A coronial inquest later reconstructed a possible chain of events. The video found on a camera gave the final glimpse. Calm seas, a fishing line dragging behind the boat. Investigators believed one of the brothers may have gone to free the line, which had likely snagged near the stern or rudder. Perhaps he lost balance and fell into the water. His brother, seeing him struggle, may have jumped in to help. The skipper could have rushed to assist, turning the boat sharply, and been struck by the swinging boom or fallen while trying to lower the sails. With no one left aboard, the Kaz II would have continued on autopilot, the wind and current guiding her toward open sea. The theory fit the data, the wind direction, the drifting pattern, the damage to the sail, but there was no proof. No one saw it happen, and no bodies were ever recovered. The 3 men seemed to have vanished into the water, leaving behind a boat that remained eerily alive. Other theories surfaced. Some speculated that sudden squalls common in the area could have tossed one or more of the men overboard. Others suggested a freak accident, perhaps involving the torn sail or a snapped line. The coroner ruled out piracy, foul play, and mechanical failure. Everything pointed to an ordinary accident that spiraled out of control in a matter of seconds. The scene inside the Kaz II became known worldwide as the ghost yacht. The image of the table set for lunch, the engine still humming, and the horizon stretching endlessly around an empty deck captured the imagination of millions. It was compared to the Mary Celeste, another ship found adrift, untouched yet deserted. Rescue teams searched for 5 days, combing hundreds of miles of sea and coastline. Not a trace of the men was found. They had likely drowned quickly, carried away by the strong current running northward along the Great Barrier Reef. The warm, open water gave no answers. When the catamaran was finally towed into Townsville, journalists and locals lined the harbour to see the vessel that had returned without its crew. Everything aboard was exactly as it had been left. A frozen moment, a normal afternoon turned inexplicable. The Kaz II was cleaned, repaired, and later sold. But in every retelling, the image remains the same. A calm sea, a gentle wind, a boat moving steadily under the sun, and 3 men who vanished without leaving a single sign of where they went or why they never came back. The Golden Orb, 2023 Gulf of Alaska seafloor. Far beneath the surface, at a depth of approximately 3,300 meters, about 2 miles, off the coast of Alaska, a remotely operated vehicle glided over a seamount during the NOAA Ocean Exploration Seascape Alaska 5 expedition. The date was the 30th of August 2023. The lights of the vehicle revealed a rocky outcrop, scattered with white sponges. At first glance, it looked like a typical deep-sea scene, but then something caught the ROV's camera, a smooth dome-shaped object, tinted gold by the lights, firmly attached to the rock. The object measured roughly 10 centimeters across, had a soft appearance, and a small hole or tear near its base. One of the dive team members joked it looked like a yellow hat sitting on the rock. Another half joked, "I just hope when we poke it something doesn't decide to come out." Scientists immediately realized they had encountered something unexpected. Using a suction sampler mounted on the ROV, the team carefully detached the orb and brought it aboard the research ship for further study. On deck, under normal light, it appeared more brown-yellow than pure gold, but its sheen, its shape, and where it was found made it unmistakably odd. Researchers confirmed it was biological in origin, but beyond that they could not classify it. Here's the first testimony from the sea. The orb's location and state, found at the bottom of the Gulf, attached to hard rock, in the midnight zone where sunlight never penetrates. Its surfaces were smooth, its contours unusual, among the typical forms of coral, sponge or egg case that deep-sea explorers often see. It sat alone, not part of a cluster of similar items, not obviously linked to a colony or nest. That alone raised questions. Next came the science and the search for meaning. The expedition's coordinator noted, "Yes, it's biological, but we don't know what species created it, or even whether it is a life stage or a whole organism." The hole near the base suggested something might have entered or exited, but nothing in the video or physical evidence matched any known egg case, sponge or sea creature shell. The surface texture felt leathery or skin-like, not the rigid or calcified structure typical of many deep-sea animals. Scientifically, the orb is remarkable because it challenges the taxonomy. One side of the debate calls it an egg casing, perhaps for a creature we have never documented. If so, whose egg could it be? The size is large for typical deep-sea eggs, and the solitary nature is unusual. On the other side, experts lean toward a form of sponge or even a detached growth from a larger organism, given the fibrous texture seen in imagery, but no definitive features of sponge anatomy are visible. What makes this discovery even more fascinating is the setting. The Gulf's deep-sea environments are among the least understood on Earth. Pressure, cold, darkness, all conspire to limit human observation. Yet in this extreme realm, life still persists, and perhaps in forms we cannot yet recognize. The orb challenges the idea that deep-sea organisms follow patterns similar to shallow water life. As one scientist put it, this object may represent an unknown life stage, a whole new species, or simply a form of organism in a life cycle phase we have never sampled. As the orb now sits in ethanol on board the ship, destined for the lab on land and for DNA analysis, the questions stack up. What is its composition? Does its genetic material match any known animal group? Is the hole a hatch, a break, or a predator's mark? Why did it appear alone rather than in a nest or colony? Could its golden colouring reflect a unique chemical pigment, or simply be a reflection of the ROV's lighting combined with its natural colouring? Each measurement brings detail: its diameter, the hole's size, the thickness of its wall, its adherence to rock. Each sample brings possible answers: cellular structure, protein-like layers, possible DNA sequences, but so far no match. The ship's wet lab announced only this: we still are not able to identify it beyond the fact that it is biological in origin. The deeper question then becomes, how many more objects like this lie undiscovered in the silent deep oceans? The golden orb stands as a witness to the unexplored. It drifts, in a sense, between what we know and what we don't. And for now, it remains a striking example of how much of the ocean still hides secrets, waiting for the cameras, the ROVs, the laboratories to bring them into view. Franklin Expedition Rex, HMS Erebus 2014, and HMS Terror 2016, Canadian Arctic. The summer of 1845 brought clear skies and a sense of optimism to England's docks. Two ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, stood ready for departure, refitted with iron plating, steam engines, and years' worth of provisions. Their mission was ambitious: to chart the last untraced section of the Northwest Passage, a sea route linking the Atlantic and Pacific through the frozen maze of the Canadian Arctic. At their head was Sir John Franklin, a decorated naval officer, confident that this voyage would secure Britain's place in exploration history. The ships carried 129 men. They left the Thames in May, passing Greenland's icy coast by July. In late summer they entered Lancaster Sound and then turned west, disappearing into the high Arctic. For 2 years nothing more was heard of them. When search parties finally arrived in the 1850s, they found only fragments: 3 graves on Beechy Island, tin cans scattered in the snow, and stories from Inuit hunters of 2 large ships trapped in the ice. The only written record left behind was a note later found inside a stone cairn on King William Island. It stated that both ships had been locked in the ice in September 1846, that Franklin had died in June 1847, and that the remaining men had decided to abandon the ships and attempt to march south toward the Back River. None of them made it. For nearly 170 years, the ships themselves remained lost. Then, in September 2014, sonar scans revealed a shadow on the seabed in the Queen Maud Gulf. It was the Erebus, resting upright, her timbers remarkably intact. 2 years later, in 2016, another wreck appeared farther north, in the calm waters of Terror Bay. The Terror lay in even better condition, sealed beneath layers of Arctic silt, windows unbroken, tables and shelves still in place. Both ships were exactly where Inuit oral traditions had long said they would be. The discoveries transformed the mystery into something tangible. Cameras sent inside the wrecks showed bottles, shoes, muskets, navigation tools, and even china plates arranged neatly in the officers' quarters. The cold, oxygen-poor water had preserved the interior almost perfectly. But if the ships endured so well, what destroyed the men who sailed them? Human remains recovered on King William Island offered grim clues. Many bones bore deep knife marks, evidence that the starving survivors may have resorted to cannibalism. Chemical tests revealed high levels of lead, likely from poorly sealed tinned food and pipes in the ship's water system. Medical experts suggested that long-term exposure could have caused severe fatigue, confusion and madness. Others pointed to scurvy, tuberculosis or botulism as additional killers. Still others believe exposure and exhaustion, not poisoning, ultimately ended their lives as they struggled through the blinding snow. The wrecks themselves offer more pieces to the puzzle. The Erebus appears to have been crushed by shifting ice, while the Terror may have drifted south after abandonment, eventually sinking in a sheltered bay. Some of the doors inside the Terror remain closed, as if the crew had only just stepped away. The logbooks and written charts, if found, could still hold legible ink under the ice-cold silt, waiting for careful recovery. Modern technology continues to map every centimetre of the sites. Drones and remotely operated vehicles sweep across the decks, photographing each artefact in place before anything is moved. Each object, a button, a spoon, a wooden writing box, adds a line to the silent story. The ship's bells have been located, still hanging. A pair of leather boots, collapsed with time, rests near a doorway. On a desk, a quill pen remains beside a glass bottle clouded with sediment. Archaeologists and conservators race against time. The warming Arctic, with its shorter winters and unstable ice, threatens to damage the wrecks that the cold once protected. Preservation teams remove only what can be safely conserved, sealing small finds in cold storage to prevent decay once they reach the surface. Each year's dive window lasts only a few weeks before storms return. From the decks of the Erebus and Terror, the Arctic is still and endless. Inside, the silence feels like that of a ship waiting for orders that will never come. The masts are long gone, but the hulls remain upright, guarding the final moments of the Franklin expedition. These relics of wood, brass, and bone continue to hold their secrets. The story of 129 men who set sail in hope and found only the frozen edges of the world. H.L. Hunley, 1864, Charleston. February 17, 1864. The American Civil War was raging across land and sea. Off the coast of Charleston, South Carolina, the night was cold, the sea calm, and the Union blockade ships stood at anchor under a moonless sky. Then, just after 9 p.m, sailors aboard the USS Housatonic spotted something strange moving slowly toward them through the dark water, a long, narrow shape, barely breaking the surface. Within minutes, an explosion tore through the harbour, and the Housatonic began to sink. It was the first ship in history to be sunk by a submarine in combat. The attacking vessel was the Confederate submersible H.L. Hunley. The Hunley was an experimental weapon built at the height of desperation. The Confederacy was being strangled by the Union blockade, and Southern engineers sought new ways to break it. Designed in Mobile, Alabama by Horace Lawson Hunley and his associates, the submarine was only 40 feet long, powered by a hand-cranked propeller turned by 8 men and guided by a single commanding officer at the front. The crew sat shoulder to shoulder in a cramped iron cylinder less than 4 feet in height. Air was limited, light non-existent, and every dive was a risk. Despite its dangers, the Hunley promised something no other weapon could: the ability to strike unseen. In its short life, the submarine had already claimed its own crews twice during training, killing 13 men, including Hunley himself, before being raised and repaired for another attempt. By February 1864, it was ready once more. Lieutenant George Dixon led the new crew of 8 on what would become their final mission. That night, the Hunley slipped silently through the water, carrying a copper-tipped spar torpedo attached to the end of a 16-foot pole. As the crew cranked the propeller, the submarine moved toward the Housatonic, anchored roughly 5 miles offshore. Witnesses on the Union ship saw the faint glimmer of the vessel's hatch just before the explosion. The torpedo struck, detonating beneath the stern. The blast ripped through the hull, sending the Housatonic to the bottom in minutes. 5 sailors died, but most escaped to lifeboats. An astonishing outcome for the time. The Hunley had made history. But then it vanished. It did not return to base, did not surface, and sent no signal. For over 130 years its fate remained unknown. Only in 1995 was the wreck located on the seabed, resting on its side about 4 miles from the attack site. In 2000, the submarine was raised intact and brought to the Warren Lash Conservation Center in Charleston, beginning a new chapter of investigation and debate. When conservators opened the hull, what they found was haunting. The crew's remains were still seated at their stations, each man at his assigned crank position. No signs of panic, no struggle, no attempt to escape. The hatches were closed, suggesting they had died suddenly. Their personal items, coins, pipes, and buttons, remained undisturbed. It appeared as though life had simply stopped. The first theories pointed to suffocation. The Hunley carried only a limited supply of oxygen, and after sealing the hatches for the mission, the air could have turned deadly within minutes. But the body's positions didn't fit that pattern. If they had slowly asphyxiated, the crew would have slumped or moved, not remained upright. Another possibility was that the explosion that sank the Housatonic had also killed the crew. The spar torpedo, packed with about 135 pounds of black powder, detonated at close range. Initially, historians believed the Hunley had released the weapon before detonation, but later analysis of the wreck showed the spar was still attached. That meant the submarine was less than 20 feet from the explosion. In 2017, researchers from Duke University tested this theory using shockwave models. They found that a blast of that magnitude could easily produce lethal pressure waves inside a closed iron cylinder, even without damaging the hull. The sudden shock could rupture lungs and eardrums, rendering the crew unconscious almost instantly. In such a case, they would have died within seconds, still seated as found. Yet some experts remain cautious. Others argue that flooding or a delayed pressure leak might have contributed. The Hunley's forward hatch was found partly open when recovered, and sediment around the hull suggests the sub may have filled slowly with water before settling on the seabed. The absence of visible trauma keeps the debate alive. Today, the Hunley rests preserved in a tank of fresh water to prevent corrosion, surrounded by the artifacts of her final mission. The captain's gold coin bent by a bullet at Shiloh, a candle stub used for light, and the hand-cranked shaft that once propelled the vessel into history. Every bolt, every dent in the hull tells a story of innovation and tragedy. The HL Hunley succeeded where no submarine had before, striking its target and changing naval warfare forever. But her crew never lived to see the world that would follow their deadly success. SS Edmund Fitzgerald, 1975, Lake Superior. The morning of November 9th, 1975, began with calm skies over Lake Superior. By evening, the largest freshwater lake in the world would turn into a graveyard. On that day, the 729-foot ore carrier Edmund Fitzgerald prepared to make what should have been a routine final voyage of the season. Her destination was a steel mill in Detroit, carrying more than 26,000 tons of taconite pellets, small iron ore marbles used for steel making. Captain Ernest McSorley, one of the most experienced skippers on the Great Lakes, commanded the ship. Alongside him were 28 crew members. The Fitzgerald left Superior, Wisconsin shortly after 2 p.m, followed closely by another freighter, the Arthur M. Anderson. Both ships moved east across Lake Superior, navigating the route toward Whitefish Bay. The forecast warned of a developing storm, but that was nothing unusual for the lake in November. Mariners called it the Witch of November, a time when warm and cold air masses collided to create sudden, violent gales. By nightfall on November 9th, the weather turned. Winds climbed past 40 knots, and waves reached 15 feet. By the next morning, gusts were over 50 knots, waves growing to nearly 30 feet. Snow squalls reduced visibility to zero. The Fitzgerald began taking on water. Captain McSorley radioed the Anderson, "We are taking heavy seas over the deck. We've got a fence rail down, 2 vents lost, and a list." But he added that they were holding their own. The two ships kept contact, sometimes only through static and broken words. At 7:10 p.m. on November 10th, the Anderson called out over the radio asking how the Fitzgerald was doing. The answer came in McSorley's steady voice, "We are holding our own." It was the last message ever received. Minutes later, radar contact vanished. The storm that night reached hurricane strength, with wind gusts over 70 miles per hour. The Fitzgerald disappeared so quickly that no distress signal was sent. The next morning, Coast Guard aircraft and vessels searched the area. By dawn, debris was found floating on the water, life rings, oil slicks, and small pieces of wreckage, but no survivors. When sonar teams finally located the wreck, it lay 530 feet down, about 17 miles north of Whitefish Point. The ship had split in two. The bow sat upright in the mud, still mostly intact, while the stern was twisted upside down about 150 feet away. No bodies were ever recovered. The cause of the sinking remains one of the most debated in maritime history. Several theories compete, each supported by evidence but never proven. One theory suggests structural failure. The Fitzgerald was heavily loaded and may have flexed in the violent waves until her hull fractured. Her hatch covers, massive steel panels that sealed the cargo holds, might have failed, allowing tons of water to flood inside. Even a small opening in those conditions could have sunk the ship within seconds. Another theory points to rogue waves. 3 unusually large waves, each higher than 35 feet, were reported by the Anderson just minutes before the Fitzgerald disappeared. Such waves, known on the Great Lakes as Three Sisters, can overwhelm even large freighters, striking in rapid succession before the ship can recover. A different idea involves grounding. The ship may have struck a shallow ridge near Caribou Island earlier that day, damaging her hull below the waterline. In that scenario, she would have been flooding slowly for hours before the final catastrophic break. The official US Coast Guard report in 1977 concluded that hatch cover failure was the most likely cause. However, many experts, including divers and naval architects, dispute that conclusion. Later studies showed that the hatch clamps were likely still intact when the ship hit bottom. The evidence, they argue, points more to structural failure of the hull itself, Perhaps a hogging stress, where the bow and stern are lifted by separate waves while the middle sags. The immense pressure could have snapped the ship in two. In 1995, Canadian divers descended to the wreck site for the first time. What they saw was haunting, the bow resting quietly, railings intact, names still visible, and the giant anchor winches frozen in place. The stern was mangled beyond recognition. The dive confirmed the ship had broken apart on the surface or just below it, descending in seconds. The crew likely never knew what happened. Today, the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald lies in two large sections, surrounded by scattered debris. The Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society monitors the site, and all dives have since been restricted out of respect for the dead. On the lake above, storms still pass, waves still rise and crash, and the bell from the Fitzgerald, recovered and preserved, tolls once each year for the 29 men who vanished with her. SS Waratah, 1909, off South Africa. In July 1909, the passenger steamer Waratah sailed proudly out of Durban, South Africa, bound for Cape Town. She was the pride of the Blue Anchor Line, a modern ship combining luxury and cargo power, built just the year before. At 465 feet long, she was often called the Titanic of the South, though her story would end far more mysteriously. The Waratah carried 211 passengers and crew. On board were businessmen, colonial families, and returning travellers from Australia. Her design was unusual. She was both a passenger liner and a freighter, with two complete decks of cabins and large holds packed with cargo, including heavy ore, food, and thousands of tons of lead and coal. To many, she seemed unsinkable. Her outward voyage from Australia to South Africa had been uneventful, but some who sailed on that first leg later expressed concern. They reported the ship feeling top-heavy, prone to rolling more than other vessels of similar size. A few passengers even refused to reboard her for the return trip, uneasy with how she handled in rough seas. The company insisted she met all standards of stability. On July 26, 1909, the Waratah left Durban for Cape Town, steaming along the South African coast with the freighter Clan McIntyre following roughly the same route. That evening, as she passed Port Shepstone, witnesses on shore saw her lights fading into the distance. The last confirmed sighting. The following morning, another ship, the Clan McIntyre, came within a few miles of what appeared to be the Waratah. They exchanged signals. Nothing unusual, just the kind of passing acknowledgement common between vessels. The weather was deteriorating, and by afternoon, strong winds began to sweep across the Indian Ocean. Heavy swells built rapidly. Then, without warning, the Waratah disappeared. When she failed to arrive at Cape Town, alarms spread across the shipping world. The Waratah had carried wireless equipment, but no distress signal was ever received. Over the following weeks, an extraordinary search effort began. Warships and merchant vessels combed the seas from Natal to Cape Town. They found nothing, no wreckage, no lifeboats, no bodies. It was as if the Waratah had been erased. For months the investigation continued. Theories soon filled the void left by her silence. One of the most enduring was that a violent storm had overwhelmed her. Weather records confirm that in late July 1909 a massive cold front hit the region, bringing hurricane-force winds and waves over 30 feet. Smaller ships nearby reported being battered but survived. The Waratah, loaded heavily and possibly unstable, may have rolled beyond recovery and gone down in minutes. Others suggested a sudden rogue wave, one of the giant walls of water that occasionally rise from nowhere in the southern oceans. A ship caught beam on by such a wave, already high in the water, could capsize instantly, yet no debris floated to confirm it. Attention also turned to her design. The Waratah had been built with a high centre of gravity, thanks to her extra deck of luxury cabins and heavy cargo stacked below. Some experts later argued that if her ballast tanks were not fully filled, or if the cargo shifted, the ship might have lost balance during a severe roll. The crew would have had little time to react. Still, not everyone accepted instability as the cause. Others claimed she suffered an explosion in her coal bunkers, a common danger in steamships of the era. Gas buildup could ignite silently and sink a ship before distress flares were possible. There were no scorch marks or debris recovered to support that, but without wreckage, every possibility stayed open. Years later, strange reports surfaced. Fishermen off the Transkei coast claimed to have seen a ghost ship matching the Waratah's silhouette weeks after she vanished. Others said wreckage washed ashore near the mouth of the Bashi River, Though none was ever verified as hers, the mystery deepened with every rumour. For more than a century, expeditions have searched the seabed along the South African coast. The waters there are treacherous. Deep canyons, strong currents, shifting sand. Dozens of wrecks lie hidden, and many believed the Waratah might rest among them. In 1999 and again in 2004, marine survey teams announced potential finds using sonar imagery, but later dives revealed those wrecks belonged to other ships. The Waratah still has never been found. Her disappearance left a mark on maritime history. The official inquiry concluded that no definite cause can be assigned, but cited weather and overloading as likely factors. Survivors from her earlier voyage continued to insist the ship had stability problems, while her builders defended her reputation until the end. The South African coast where she vanished remains one of the most dangerous stretches of ocean in the world, a place sailors call the Wild Coast. In that turbulent water, beneath waves that can rise taller than buildings, somewhere lies the unanswered story of the Waratah, a ship that vanished without a single cry for help, without a trace, leaving nothing but her name drifting on the wind. SS Baychimo, 1931 to 1969 Arctic. The Arctic Ocean in winter is a place of silence and drifting ice, where the horizon and sea become one. In the autumn of 1931, a steel cargo ship named Baychimo sailed those frozen waters for the last time, and would soon become one of the strangest maritime stories in modern history. The Baychimo was a steel-hulled freighter operated by the Hudson's Bay Company, built in Sweden in 1914 and originally named Anger Manelfven. After World War I, she was sold to the Canadians and renamed Baychimo. Her job was to trade furs and supplies along the remote Arctic coast between Vancouver and the settlements of northern Canada. For years she made the same voyage, moving through routes that were passable only in summer when the ice broke up enough to let ships through. In late 1931, she left Vancouver on what should have been a routine run to pick up pelts from Inuit traders. The voyage was normal until early October, when she reached the coast near Barrow, now Utqiagvik, Alaska. There, an early storm swept across the Arctic. Temperatures plunged and the sea began to freeze faster than expected. Within days, thick ice surrounded the ship, locking it in place about 15 miles offshore. Captain Cornwall and his crew tried everything to free her, but the ice held firm. With supplies running low, the Hudson's Bay Company sent aircraft to retrieve some of the cargo and evacuate most of the crew. About 15 men, including the captain, stayed behind, setting up a camp on the ice to watch over the ship and wait for a thaw. On October the 15th, a violent blizzard struck. When the storm finally cleared, the men looked toward the horizon, and the Baychimo was gone. The ice had shifted during the storm and the ship had broken free. Some believed she'd sunk beneath the ice. Others thought she'd drifted away into open water. But days later, an Inuit seal hunter reported sighting her roughly 45 miles away, trapped once again in a new patch of ice. The crew trekked overland to reach her, salvaged part of the cargo and abandoned the rest. Believing the ship would not survive the winter, they left her behind for good. But the Baychimo did survive. In the spring of 1932, reports began coming in. The same ship had been seen adrift in the Beaufort Sea, still intact, drifting silently with the ice. Over the next decades, fishermen, whalers and coastal villagers all reported sightings of the Baychimo, a ghostly vessel emerging from the fog, its decks empty, hull weathered, slowly moving with the current before disappearing again. In 1933, a group of Inuit hunters actually boarded her near Wainwright, Alaska, seeking shelter from a storm. They found her in remarkably good condition and stayed overnight before leaving. 2 years later, in 1935, she was seen again, ice-locked but still upright. In 1939, another expedition tried to reach her but failed due to heavy pack ice. She was spotted intermittently throughout the 1940s, 1950s, and even into the 1960s. The sightings became part of Arctic folklore. Each account described the same thing, a derelict ship moving slowly under its own momentum, sometimes frozen in place, sometimes drifting hundreds of miles from her last known position. Some claimed to have boarded her and found everything still inside, rusting machinery, barrels and tools left untouched since the day she was deserted. How a steel freighter could survive for decades in such a brutal environment puzzled experts. The Arctic's cold preserved her hull, preventing rapid corrosion, while her sealed compartments gave her unusual buoyancy. With no one aboard to maintain her, she drifted freely across some of the most unforgiving waters on Earth. Her final verified sighting came in 1969, nearly 40 years after she had been abandoned. A group of Inuit hunters saw the Baychimo still afloat near Point Barrow, trapped once again in thin ice. When the ice broke up later that season, she was gone. No one has seen her since. Despite numerous searches, no confirmed wreck has ever been found. The Arctic seabed in the region is vast and largely uncharted, covered in layers of sediment and shifting ice flows that could have easily swallowed her without trace. The Alaskan government conducted searches in the early 2000s using sonar, hoping to locate what they called the Arctic Ghost Ship, but nothing conclusive was discovered. To this day, the Baychimo remains a legend, a ship that defied the elements, outlasted her crew, and wandered one of the harshest regions on the planet for nearly half a century. In the dim Arctic light, sailors still tell of her silhouette appearing on the horizon, silent and empty, moving with the slow, unstoppable rhythm of the ice. USS Cyclops, 1918 Atlantic, March 1918. The Great War was nearing its end, but the Atlantic was still a dangerous place. German submarines prowled the shipping lanes, and the US Navy's coal-carrying fleet was running non-stop to keep the war effort alive. Among those ships was the USS Cyclops, a massive collier, 542 feet long, displacing more than 19,000 tons, the largest vessel in the Navy at the time. Her job was to carry coal and manganese ore between American ports and US outposts in the Caribbean. On March 4th, she left the harbour of Barbados after loading over 10,000 tons of ore bound for Baltimore. Her commander, Lieutenant Commander George W. Worley, reported that one of the ship's engines was under repair but still operational. The seas were calm, the weather clear, she never arrived. The Cyclops carried 309 people, crew, passengers, and naval personnel, all of whom vanished without a single distress signal. Her disappearance remains one of the largest losses of life in US naval history not caused by combat. The story began 2 months earlier, in January 1918, when she departed Norfolk, Virginia, heading south to Rio de Janeiro. The voyage was routine. In Rio, she loaded manganese ore used for steel production, then sailed for Bahia, Brazil, before making a final stop in Barbados. Witnesses there said the ship appeared seaworthy, though heavily loaded. She took on coal, filed her route plan, and set sail northward. That was the last anyone saw of her. When she failed to reach Baltimore, the Navy initiated a massive search across the Caribbean and Western Atlantic. Battleships, patrol boats, and aircraft scoured the route for weeks. Not a single piece of wreckage, oil slick, or debris was found. No SOS signal was ever received, despite the ship's powerful radio. The weather during her voyage was reported fair, which made the loss even harder to explain. The first theory was structural failure. The Cyclops belonged to the Proteius-class colliers, known for their heavy load capacity, but also for potential weaknesses. Later ships of the same design, the Proteius and Nereus, would themselves vanish without trace during World War II. Investigators suggested that uneven cargo loading could have caused her to list or even capsize, especially with one engine out and her hull possibly weakened by earlier service. But others pointed to human factors. Captain Worley was an unusual figure. Born in Germany, naturalized in the United States, and reportedly a strict disciplinarian who was unpopular with some of his crew. After the disappearance, rumours spread that he was pro-German and that sabotage might have been involved. Yet there is no evidence of espionage or mutiny, and the Navy ultimately dismissed those claims as wartime speculation. The sea itself may have played the decisive role. The area between Barbados and the US East Coast sits along the edge of the Sargasso Sea, a region known for powerful currents and sudden storms. One possibility is that the Cyclops encountered a microburst, a short-lived but violent wind event capable of overwhelming a ship in minutes. Heavy with ore, the vessel could have rolled and sunk before anyone could signal for help. The manganese cargo, dense and shifting, might have amplified instability during any sharp roll. Another theory suggests catastrophic engine failure. With one shaft already compromised, an explosion in the remaining boiler room could have ripped through the hull. In wartime, with fuel and ammunition on board, even a small detonation could destroy communications equipment instantly. No distress call would have been possible. The Navy's official investigation, completed in June 1918, recorded the loss as a mystery. They found no proof of enemy action, no evidence of foul play, and no technical explanation that fit every fact. Decades later, historians examined the ship's maintenance logs and noted repeated reports of structural fatigue and cracked beams, weaknesses that could have doomed her under heavy stress. Still, if she broke apart, why did nothing rise to the surface? The disappearance eventually became tied to a broader legend, the Bermuda Triangle. The ship's last known position was within the area later associated with other, unexplained maritime and aviation vanishings. Yet oceanographers point out that the region's deep trenches and strong currents can easily hide wrecks forever. The seafloor there drops rapidly to more than 16,000 feet. A steel ship descending intact could reach the bottom before breaking apart, leaving few floating traces. In 1968 and again in 2009, deep-sea expeditions searched sections of the suspected route using sonar and submersibles. None found any sign of the Cyclops. The ocean floor remains littered with hundreds of unidentified wrecks, any of which could hold her remains. Today, the ship's loss is still listed by the Navy as cause unknown. Her name is etched on memorial walls alongside other vessels lost at sea. What is known is simple. She departed Barbados on a calm day carrying 309 souls and vanished somewhere between the Caribbean and the Chesapeake, leaving behind only silence and speculation. USS Scorpion, 1968 Atlantic. The spring of 1968 was a tense season beneath the world's oceans. The Cold War was at its height, and the United States Navy had more than 60 submarines patrolling the seas, each part of a silent chess game with the Soviet fleet. Among them was the nuclear-powered attack submarine USS Scorpion, hull number SSN 589, homeported in Norfolk, Virginia. She was sleek, fast, and built to hunt. On May 20th, 1968, the Scorpion was returning from a deployment in the Mediterranean, heading back to the United States. She carried 99 men. Her last radio transmission came that day, reporting her position about 400 miles southwest of the Azores. After that, there was nothing. When she failed to arrive in Norfolk 9 days later, the Navy declared her overdue. The disappearance of a nuclear submarine carrying 2 torpedoes armed with nuclear warheads triggered an international search unlike any before. The Navy dispatched dozens of ships and aircraft, sweeping thousands of square miles across the Atlantic. Families waited for word, but none came. The ocean offered only silence. By June, the Navy officially listed the Scorpion as lost. What followed was one of the most extensive deep-sea investigations in naval history. Using classified sonar arrays from the Navy's sound surveillance system, scientists traced a faint acoustic signal, a distant sequence of implosions recorded on May 22nd. The data pointed to a location about 400 miles southwest of the Azores, near the mid-Atlantic ridge. It took months before they found her. In October 1968, the oceanographic research ship Mizar deployed deep-sea cameras and sonar. The images that returned revealed the Scorpion, resting more than 10,000 feet down, broken in 2 main sections. The sail was crushed, the forward hull twisted, the stern lying nearby. The wreck was eerily intact for a submarine that had collapsed under such enormous pressure. The official Navy inquiry concluded in 1969 with a verdict that offered no clear cause. It listed the loss as due to an unknown event. But investigators had theories. One centered on the Scorpion's battery system. Maintenance records showed the ship had recurring electrical problems. In particular, one of her main batteries had shown signs of overheating and hydrogen gas buildup. If a battery exploded, even a small ignition in a sealed compartment could trigger catastrophic flooding and loss of control. Acoustic analysis of the implosion sequence recorded in May 1968 showed a sharp sound possibly consistent with an internal explosion followed by a hull collapse. Another theory pointed to a malfunctioning torpedo. The Scorpion carried Mark 37 electric torpedoes, which were known to develop faulty heat sensors. In this scenario, one torpedo may have activated while still inside the tube, forcing the crew to attempt an emergency launch. If it recircled or detonated nearby, the blast could have compromised the pressure hull. Some submariners believed the Scorpion was destroyed by one of its own weapons. A third theory, whispered during the Cold War, involved Soviet forces. In the same year, the Soviet submarine K-129 had sunk in the Pacific under mysterious circumstances, leading some to believe the Scorpion was lost in retaliation. but declassified records decades later revealed no evidence of Soviet involvement in the Atlantic that week. The sonar data, too, did not match the signature of an external explosion or collision. The wreck site itself deepened the mystery. The submarine's bow was crushed inward, and debris scattered across 3,000 feet of seabed. The escape hatches were closed, and no sign of an attempt to surface was found. Portions of the hull bore no burn marks or external damage, suggesting the destruction began from within. One of the propeller shafts was bent backward, and the rudders jammed hard to one side, indicating the crew may have been fighting to control the submarine in its final moments. The Navy's own scientific study, known as Project Azorian, later used the Scorpion wreck data to model submersible implosion dynamics. By comparing the recorded acoustic data to implosion tests, they determined the submarine likely suffered a catastrophic hull collapse around 9,000 feet of depth, creating a pressure wave strong enough to crush everything inside in less than a fraction of a second. Divers and remotely operated vehicles have since revisited the site, photographing the wreck in detail. The reactor compartment lies intact, sealed by the pressure of the descent. Radiation readings show no leak. The torpedo room, however, was destroyed, lending some weight to the theory of a self-initiated detonation. For the families of the 99 men, each new study brought more data but not more certainty. Engineers argued over wiring diagrams, battery chemistry, and sonar signatures. Naval architects debated stress fractures versus explosions. Every test narrowed the possibilities, but none could define the single event that doomed the ship. The Scorpion still rests deep in the Atlantic, nearly 2 miles beneath the surface. Its steel hull, distorted by pressure, remains an artifact of both technological achievement and mystery. Whether the cause was electrical failure, mechanical malfunction, or something that will never be known, the Scorpion continues to mark one of the most haunting disappearances in naval history, a loss recorded only by the faint final echo of a sound beneath the sea. Flight MH370 Oceanic Debris, 2015 Indian Ocean, March 8, 2014. A Boeing 777 lifted off from Kuala Lumpur just after midnight, bound for Beijing. It was a routine overnight flight designated Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. On board were 239 people, passengers, pilots and crew from more than a dozen countries. At 1:19 a.m, as the aircraft crossed from Malaysian to Vietnamese airspace, the co-pilot spoke the final words ever heard, "Good night, Malaysian 370. 2 minutes later, the plane vanished from radar. For a few moments, air traffic controllers assumed it was a technical issue, but when repeated calls went unanswered and the aircraft never reappeared on Vietnamese screens, it became clear that something extraordinary had occurred. In the hours that followed, radar data showed the aircraft had turned sharply west, crossed the Malay Peninsula, and then south into the open ocean. Its transponder, which broadcasts identification and altitude, had been switched off. The disappearance triggered one of the largest searches in aviation and maritime history. Dozens of ships and aircraft from multiple countries combed the seas, initially in the Gulf of Thailand and the South China Sea, then gradually farther west into the Indian Ocean. Satellite analysis of automated handshakes between the aircraft and ground stations showed that the plane had continued flying for nearly 7 more hours after losing contact. Its final path ended somewhere along a vast arc in the southern Indian Ocean, an area known for extreme depth, rough seas and powerful currents. Despite early confusion and false reports, no wreckage was found for more than a year. Then, in July 2015, on the French island of Réunion, nearly 2,500 miles from the suspected crash zone, a piece of aircraft debris washed ashore. It was a flaperon, part of a Boeing 777's wing. Investigators confirmed it belonged to Flight MH370. It was the first physical proof that the aircraft had indeed gone down at sea. The discovery reignited global efforts to trace the ocean's drift patterns. Oceanographers began mapping currents using satellite-tracked buoys, computer simulations, and data on floating debris. The Indian Ocean's circulation was unpredictable, but experts determined that wreckage from the southern arc could easily travel thousands of miles before reaching Africa's east coast. Over the next 2 years, additional fragments appeared on beaches across the western Indian Ocean. A horizontal stabilizer found in Mozambique, an interior panel in South Africa, wing and cabin pieces in Tanzania and Mauritius, all confirmed or considered highly likely to have come from MH370. Each one carried unique signs of long exposure: barnacles, salt bleaching, and damage consistent with high-speed impact followed by months adrift. The pattern of debris suggested that the aircraft had entered the water in a steep, fast descent, breaking apart but leaving large sections intact. Yet despite more than 120,000 square kilometres of seabed being scanned by sonar between 2014 and 2017, no main wreckage was ever located. The seafloor terrain in the southern Indian Ocean proved far more complex than expected: deep ridges, trenches and volcanic plateaus nearly 4 miles beneath the surface. In 2018, a private company conducted a renewed search, using autonomous underwater vehicles capable of mapping areas missed in earlier sweeps. Still, the results were the same: empty ocean floor. The final resting place of the fuselage remains unconfirmed. Scientists studying the debris found fascinating biological and environmental clues. The reunion flaperon, for instance, was covered in barnacles known as Lepasannatifera. These crustaceans grow only in specific temperature zones, allowing researchers to backtrack the approximate oceanic route of the part. By comparing shell growth patterns, they estimated that the wreckage had drifted for more than a year across equatorial waters before landing on the island's coast. Every discovery was handled with meticulous care. Pieces were logged, photographed, and sent to laboratories in France and Australia. Some contained serial numbers linking them directly to the lost aircraft. Others carried human-made inscriptions, markings from maintenance, serial codes from hydraulic systems, silent identifiers that tied them back to the flight that disappeared. Even as the evidence accumulated, questions remained about the final hours. Why had the plane turned? Who was in control? Data showed the aircraft maintained altitude changes and deliberate headings, implying that someone was still flying it for much of the journey. But the debris told a simpler story of impact, disintegration, and drift. The slow process by which a modern machine became a part of the ocean's endless movement. By 2020, oceanographers had modelled dozens of possible drift scenarios. Many pointed to an area west of Australia, near the so-called Seventh Arc, where satellite data suggested the flight ended. Others proposed a point farther north, near the Broken Ridge Plateau. In both cases, the seabed is rugged and difficult to survey, with trenches deep enough to conceal even large wrecks. Fragments of MH370 continue to wash ashore, faint reminders of an aircraft that crossed invisible lines and fell into silence. Each barnacle-covered piece that surfaces on a beach is another voice from the sea, another clue pulled from the Indian Ocean's currents. The full wreckage, however, still lies hidden somewhere beneath thousands of meters of water, a mystery resting beyond the reach of light and radar, waiting to be found. Upsweep, since 1991, Central Pacific. In the heart of the Pacific Ocean, far from any shore, instruments deep beneath the surface have been listening for decades. They were built to detect submarines, track undersea earthquakes, and record the planet's hidden acoustics. But in 1991, one of these sensors, part of the US National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's hydrophone network, captured something unexpected, a sound unlike any ever recorded before. The noise was low and mechanical in rhythm, but not man-made. It began as a long, drawn-out whoop, rising in pitch, a sweeping pattern that repeated over and over, sometimes lasting minutes. Scientists called it upsweep. It came from somewhere in the Central Pacific near the equator, in a remote region between New Zealand and South America. At first, researchers thought it was an equipment error, but every hydrophone that covered that region heard it, hundreds of miles apart all at the same time. The signal was powerful enough to travel across the ocean, reverberating through the sound channel, a natural layer of water that allows sound waves to move vast distances without fading. When the recordings were analysed, the mystery deepened. The sound had a consistent structure, a series of narrow band tones that steadily rose in frequency, starting low and sweeping upward, repeating every few seconds. It was heard most strongly in the spring and fall, and then it faded, only to return again the next year. Since then, upsweep has never stopped. Over 30 years later, the sound still appears each season, still pulsing through the Pacific's depths. Its intensity varies year to year, but the signal itself remains the same, a strange haunting pattern echoing across thousands of miles of ocean. The NOAA researchers confirmed that the sound was not caused by ships, submarines, or seismic equipment. It wasn't linked to earthquakes or volcanic eruptions that they could identify. Its origin was fixed roughly in the mid-Pacific, near a chain of underwater volcanoes called the Pacific-Antarctic Ridge. This area lies along the boundary of two tectonic plates, where magma rises from the Earth's mantle and new ocean crust forms. The first hypothesis was volcanic. The pattern and seasonal rhythm could match hydrothermal activity, the movement of hot water and gases from vents beneath the seabed. These eruptions can release large amounts of energy and produce distinct acoustic signals as gas bubbles burst and water boils in the dark. But no single volcano in that region has been found that emits a sound lasting decades with such consistency. Another idea focused on marine life. The oceans are filled with biological noise. The calls of whales, the drumming of fish, the clicks of crustaceans. But even the loudest known whales, like blue or fin whales, make calls with identifiable patterns and intervals. Upsweep doesn't match any known animal sound. It's too powerful, too regular, and its tone far higher than most whale calls. In the early 1990s, researchers cross-checked every known biological dataset. No match was found. Over the years, NOAA's hydrophones have catalogued many other unexplained undersea sounds: the bloop in 1997, the whistle, the train, the Julia. Most of those have since been traced to natural causes, shifting ice, volcanic events, or the movement of seafloor ridges, but upsweep remains one of the few that resists full explanation. Part of the challenge lies in the ocean itself. The Central Pacific is vast, with little direct access for research vessels. The exact coordinates of the sound's source have been narrowed to a zone of hundreds of square kilometres, too large and deep for a single investigation. Attempts to triangulate the signal suggest it may come from multiple vents or fractures along the ridge, changing slightly with the seasons as ocean temperature and pressure shift. Data collected over the years show a slow decline in volume. The sound that once rang strong in 1991 is now fainter, though still detectable. This might indicate that the process generating it, whether geological or chemical, is weakening. If volcanic, it could mean that the magma flow beneath the ridge is cooling or stabilizing. If biological, it could mean that whatever organism or mechanism produced it is becoming less active. Scientists listening through the Global Acoustic Network continue to monitor upsweep each year. Its recurring tone serves as both a reminder and a measurement, a sign that the Earth itself is still making sounds we don't fully understand. The recordings are accessible to researchers around the world. Long, rising sequences, deep yet sharp, fading in and out with the movement of the ocean's layers. No ship has ever visited the exact source. The area lies in deep international waters, more than 2 miles beneath the surface, far beyond the reach of light. When the sound rises each spring, it passes unnoticed by anyone on the surface. A ghostly echo from below, captured only by machines. It begins low, grows higher, and vanishes, just as it has for more than 3 decades, the 52 hertz wail. It started as a trace on a spectrogram, a thin, bright line cutting across the low-frequency hum of the Pacific Ocean. In 1989, researchers at the US Navy's Pacific Acoustic Monitoring System noticed something unusual in their underwater recordings. Among the distant rumble of submarines and whale calls, one sound stood out. It pulsed in regular intervals, like a heartbeat, but its pitch was different, much higher than any whale ever recorded. Most large whales, such as blue and fin whales, call at frequencies between 15 and 25 hertz, deep thunder-like sounds that carry across thousands of miles of ocean. But this one called at 52 hertz, far above that range. The call patterns, though, resembled those of baleen whales, long, moaning pulses repeated in seasonal patterns. Whoever or whatever was making them was behaving like a whale, but not sounding like one. The discovery was made using the US Navy's SOSUS network, an array of hydrophones originally designed to detect submarines during the Cold War. After the system was partially declassified, oceanographers began using it to study marine life. When they analysed the mysterious signal, it appeared consistently each year, migrating through the Pacific along paths similar to known whale routes. Researchers began referring to it as the 52 hertz whale. It was the only one of its kind. The calls came at regular intervals, rising slightly in pitch before fading. The sound was strong enough to travel over vast distances, meaning the animal behind it had to be large, at least the size of a baleen whale, but its exact identity was unclear. Some thought it might be a malformed blue whale, perhaps with an abnormal vocal structure that produced higher tones. Others speculated it was a hybrid, possibly a cross between a blue and a fin whale whose ranges overlap. The acoustic signature didn't perfectly match either species, yet its rhythm and migration suggested it belonged to the same group of giants that roam the open sea. The recordings showed that the whale moved through the North Pacific, often between the Aleutian Islands and California. Each winter the calls shifted south, returning north again in summer. This pattern mirrored known migratory cycles, reinforcing the idea that it was following instinct, a solitary traveller moving through the same routes that others of its kind used, but at a frequency no other whale seemed to recognise. No second voice ever answered. By the early 2000s, marine biologists had tracked the 52 hertz whale for more than a decade. Its calls persisted year after year, consistent in tone and timing. The animal appeared to be alive and healthy, covering thousands of miles of ocean. What puzzled scientists most was its uniqueness. In all the hydrophone records spanning decades, no other whale had ever been detected calling at or near that same frequency. Hydroacoustic experts analysed the signal strength and estimated the source was capable of travelling hundreds of miles in a single season. The call's power was remarkable, but the pitch, so far above the typical range, raised questions about its purpose. If whales communicate partly through matching frequencies, this one may have been calling into silence, unheard by others of its kind. Some researchers suggested that the whale might not be entirely alone, that other whales could hear it but choose not to respond, as the signal lies at the edge of their perceptual range. Others believed it was genuinely solitary, possibly a survivor of an isolated genetic line, or the last of an unknown population. Public fascination with the world's loneliest whale grew after recordings were released to the public. The slow, haunting pattern of the 52 hertz call became symbolic, a reminder of how vast and empty the ocean can be. Artists, musicians and writers referenced it as a metaphor for solitude. But in the scientific community, the focus remained on what the data could reveal about whale diversity. Attempts to locate the whale physically have never succeeded. Its calls can be triangulated within wide regions, but the Pacific is too vast and its source too mobile. No ship has ever captured a visual confirmation. Advanced autonomous recorders deployed across the Pacific in the 2010 ESSA still occasionally detect the same frequency. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. There are small variations over time. The call has slowed slightly and sometimes fluctuates between 49 and 52 hertz. That suggests the whale, if still alive, has aged. Some marine biologists believe that the shift could also mean multiple whales may now be producing similar sounds, though no direct evidence supports that yet. The recordings are still archived by NOAA and other research institutions. Each file contains the same steady pulse, a high, lonely tone rising through the depths, marking its presence somewhere out there in the dark. It repeats every 30 to 40 seconds, consistent as a metronome. It does not overlap with known species songs, but it moves with them, as if following a world that cannot hear it. Even after 3 decades, the 52 hertz whale remains a living question beneath the sea. A voice carried through thousands of miles of cold water, unseen, still calling, its origin and identity a mystery the ocean refuses to give away. Milky seas. On some nights in the world's warm oceans, ships cross water that glows like liquid light. The surface turns pale blue or white, spreading for miles in every direction. The horizon disappears, and the ocean itself seems to shine from within. Sailors call it the Milky Sea, a rare and silent phenomenon that has been witnessed for centuries, yet still resists full explanation. The first written accounts date back to the 17th century, when mariners described white seas that illuminated their ships in the dark. In the 1800s, British sailors in the Indian Ocean reported vessels moving through what looked like a field of snow. Some said they could read by the light of the water. For generations, the stories sounded like exaggerations, until modern science confirmed that they were real. Milky seas are different from the short bursts of blue sparks seen in ordinary bioluminescent waves near coastlines. Those fleeting flashes come from tiny plankton reacting to motion. A milky sea, on the other hand, is steady and uniform, glowing continuously for hours or even days, covering areas that can exceed the size of entire countries. The phenomenon was first verified with instruments in the 1980s, when researchers collected water samples from a glowing patch near the Arabian Sea. Under microscopes, they found billions of bioluminescent bacteria, species such as Vibrio harveyi and Vibrio fischeri. These bacteria emit light as part of a chemical reaction involving luciferase, an enzyme that produces a bluish glow when oxygen reacts with specific organic compounds. What makes milky seas so mysterious is their sheer scale. A typical bioluminescent bloom might cover a few square meters, but recorded milky seas can extend over 15,000 square kilometers, nearly the size of Connecticut, glowing so brightly that satellites can see them from orbit. The light is often uniform, as if the ocean's surface were coated with a luminous film. In 2005, a NASA satellite captured one of the clearest modern examples, a vast glowing region south of Somalia, stretching for hundreds of kilometers across the Arabian Sea. It remained visible for 3 consecutive nights. The event matched a report from a merchant vessel passing through the same area, whose crew described the ocean glowing with the brightness of snow under moonlight. Subsequent satellite analyses revealed that such events are not as rare as once thought. They appear to cluster mainly in the northwestern Indian Ocean, near the Arabian Sea, and in parts of the Java and Banda Seas of Indonesia. Most occur between late spring and early winter, when monsoon-driven upwelling brings nutrient-rich waters to the surface, a perfect environment for microbial blooms. Scientists believe that milky seas form when colonies of Vibrio bacteria grow symbiotically on microscopic organic particles or phytoplankton aggregates, spreading across calm, stratified layers of warm surface water. These bacteria produce light continuously when their population density reaches a certain threshold, a phenomenon called quorum sensing. It's a form of microbial communication. Once enough bacteria are present, they collectively trigger bioluminescence through chemical signaling. Still, many questions remain. Why do some blooms grow to such massive scales while others remain small? Why do the bacteria emit light so steadily, instead of flashing like coastal plankton? And how can their glow remain visible for days without being disrupted by waves or currents? Field studies are rare, mainly because it's nearly impossible to predict where or when a milky sea will form. The ocean regions where they appear are vast and remote, often far from shipping lanes. Even when detected by satellite, by the time a research vessel can reach the site, the glow has usually faded. Only a handful of direct samples have ever been collected. One theory proposes that certain oceanic conditions, a stable surface layer, high organic content, and limited turbulence, create the perfect balance for sustained bacterial light. The glow might be a byproduct of metabolism, or it may serve as a lure for fish, whose digestive systems help the bacteria disperse. Another idea links the phenomenon to massive algal blooms that die off, releasing nutrients the bacteria then consume. In 2019, researchers used the new VITHAS instrument aboard NOAA's Suomi NPP satellite to detect another giant milky sea south of Java, Indonesia. This one stretched for more than 100,000 square kilometers and glowed for almost 2 weeks. Despite being visible from space, no ship reached it in time for sampling, leaving its composition unverified. Every recorded event strengthens the connection between microbial life and this eerie light, but none has yet revealed exactly what starts or sustains it. Each time a milky sea appears, it reminds scientists how much of the ocean remains unexplored. Vast stretches where invisible communities of bacteria can, for reasons still unknown, turn entire seas into radiant white. Aligned holes on the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, 2022. In July 2022, a research vessel glided above a section of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, the massive underwater mountain chain that divides the Atlantic Ocean nearly in half. The expedition, led by NOAA Ocean Exploration, used remotely operated vehicles to survey the seafloor more than 2.5 kilometers below the surface. What they found that day left scientists silent for a moment, staring at their screens. On the monitor, the dark volcanic plain came into view, cold, still, covered with layers of fine sediment. Then the camera panned across something that didn't belong. A line of small holes, evenly spaced and perfectly straight, stretched across the seabed like a dotted path. Each perforation was roughly the size of a human finger, surrounded by a faint mound of displaced sediment. The holes appeared in pairs, 2 rows running parallel, sometimes curving slightly, then continuing for meters. At first glance it looked mechanical, as if something had dragged a tool or probe through the sediment. The alignment was too precise to be random, too organized to be natural erosion. But no human machine had been there. The site was remote, thousands of meters deep, far from any known cable routes or mining zones. The crew immediately began documenting the find. The robotic arm measured the holes, around 3 to 5 centimeters wide, spaced roughly 10 centimeters apart. The ROV's suction sampler collected sediment samples, but when the arm tried to dig beneath the openings, it hit resistance. The holes didn't seem to go deep. They looked more like impressions or burrows that stopped just below the surface. Scientists on board discussed possibilities. Could they be biological? Many deep-sea organisms leave patterned traces, burrows, feeding pits or trails, but these were unusually tidy, almost geometric. Some speculated that they might be the work of burrowing animals, perhaps shrimp or worms, acting in coordinated ways. Others noted that no such species is known to dig in straight lines over such distances. Volcanic activity was considered next. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge is a tectonic boundary where magma rises and new crust forms, so the seafloor there is riddled with hydrothermal vents and fractures. Perhaps escaping gas or fluid had forced its way up in a linear pattern, yet the holes showed no thermal discoloration, no mineral deposits typical of vent activity. Their edges were clean, undisturbed by heat. The discovery wasn't entirely without precedent. In 2004, another NOAA team on the same ridge had encountered similar rows of holes, again aligned, again unexplained. Those earlier observations were made with less advanced equipment, and at the time researchers had no way to analyse them in detail. 18 years later, the new expedition stumbled upon nearly identical formations, this time at multiple sites hundreds of miles apart. The holes sparked wide public attention once NOAA shared the images. Online, people compared them to the marks left by machine treads, extraterrestrial patterns, or seafloor cables. Scientists, meanwhile, began comparing the data with existing geological maps. None of the locations corresponded to known fault lines or anthropogenic structures. A closer look revealed that some of the openings contained fine trails of sediment, as though something had been moving beneath the surface. The surrounding material appeared disturbed only in narrow bands, supporting the idea of an organism tunneling just below the seabed. Deep-sea biologists proposed that the holes might be entrances and exits of a buried creature, possibly using the pattern for feeding or respiration. The symmetry could result from the animal pushing sediment out in 2 directions as it advanced. Still, no one had seen such behaviour directly. The ROVs stayed in position for hours, cameras focused, waiting for movement. Nothing appeared. The ocean floor remained motionless, the holes as lifeless as before. The expedition continued mapping the ridge, finding more clusters at depths between 2,500 and 3,000 meters. Each line followed a similar scale, suggesting a consistent mechanism. No debris, cables, or human waste were found nearby. Magnetometer readings showed no sign of metallic interference. Whatever made them, it wasn't a leftover artifact from exploration equipment. Samples collected around the holes were brought to the surface and later examined in labs. The sediment composition was normal volcanic clay mixed with small fragments of basalt. Microbial DNA analysis showed standard deep-sea bacterial communities, no unusual concentrations that might indicate chemical seepage or hydrothermal fluids. The holes themselves, however, had compacted walls, suggesting repeated disturbance, as if something had pressed or dug there multiple times. One hypothesis links the formations to benthic animals known as ecurans, or spoonworms, which sometimes burrow in patterns when feeding. Another compares them to burrows made by amphipods in shallow water, though none are known to survive at such depths. A third possibility involves unknown geological gas release, small eruptions of methane or carbon dioxide that might burst through the sediment, leaving aligned openings along a subsurface fracture. None of these explanations fit perfectly. The holes are too consistent for random venting, too large and orderly for microbial gas release, and too straight for biological randomness. Yet they clearly exist, spread across different parts of the ridge, waiting for the next expedition to catch one forming in real time. The NOAA scientists who discovered them left with hours of footage and thousands of images. Each dotted path shining under the ROV's lights cuts across an otherwise untouched world, a sign of motion, precision, and purpose in a place where almost nothing moves. Somewhere deep beneath the Atlantic, something carved neat lines into the Earth's crust, and no one yet knows what or how. The Arctic Ping, 2016, Fury and Hecla Strait. In the summer of 2016, hunters from a small Inuit community in Nunavut, northern Canada, noticed something strange in the water. They were in the Fury and Hecla Strait, a narrow, icy channel between Baffin Island and the Melville Peninsula, a place usually filled with seals, whales, and migrating caribou. But that year, the animals were gone. The hunters described the sea as empty and quiet. Quiet, except for one thing. From beneath the ice, they began hearing a sound, a steady, metallic pinging that seemed to pulse through the water. Some said it was high and sharp like sonar. Others described it as a hum that rose and faded. It lasted for weeks. No one could tell where it came from. For the Inuit, the sound was unsettling. The region was part of a traditional hunting ground known as Hecla and Fury, named after two British exploration ships that had once passed through in the 1820s. The strait is shallow, isolated, and usually frozen most of the year. The noise was new, and it coincided with an unusual absence of wildlife. Hunters who had lived there all their lives said they had never seen anything like it. In October, the Canadian Armed Forces sent a patrol vessel, HMCS Summerside, to investigate. The Navy deployed sonar scanners and underwater microphones, sweeping the area for hours. They expected to find something simple, maybe an industrial device, an echo from an ice shelf, or an underwater beacon. But when the readings came back, there was nothing. The military found no submarines, no ships, no mining equipment, and no active sonar. Even after days of monitoring, the ping failed to repeat while they were on site. To this day, no physical source has ever been identified. The mystery attracted national attention. Theories began to form. Some suspected that an underwater exploration company had been using sonar mapping for mineral surveys. Others pointed toward environmental groups who might have been using acoustic devices to discourage hunting, an accusation never supported by evidence. The closest mining operation, the Baffinland Iron Mines site, denied conducting any underwater activity. The sound's location made things even stranger. The Fury and Hecla Strait sits above a complex seafloor filled with fractures, moving ice sheets and narrow channels. The water there is only about 150 meters deep, and ice movements are powerful enough to shear large sections of the seabed each year. Scientists later suggested that the ping could have been the product of shifting ice, pressure ridges scraping against the seafloor, releasing bursts of sound as the ice flexed and cracked. But the Inuit hunters who first heard it said it wasn't random. The tone was too regular, too mechanical. It repeated with an even rhythm, audible from miles away. When they dropped hydrophones into the water themselves, they recorded a signal distinct from the crackle of ice. It had a measurable pattern. Acousticians who studied the recordings noted that certain ice events can produce consistent tones when trapped air bubbles or resonant cavities are compressed under pressure. The Arctic environment acts like an amplifier. Sound can travel vast distances through the water and under the ice. In that context, even a small natural vibration could seem artificial. However, there was one detail that didn't fit the usual explanation: the absence of wildlife. Marine mammals, especially seals and whales, are highly sensitive to underwater sound. Loud, unfamiliar noise can drive them away or disrupt their migration. In 2016, the hunting community of Igloolik reported that the Fury and Hecla Strait, once filled with animals, had gone silent almost overnight. That coincidence made many believe the sound had to be acoustic in nature, powerful enough to alter the animal's behaviour. The Canadian military's survey used side-scan sonar, radar, and magnetometers to rule out foreign submarines or military equipment. They also flew aircraft over the area to look for buoys or research instruments. None were found. When the ice returned later that winter, the sound seemed to stop altogether. Over the next few years, scientists attempted to monitor the strait during the open water season. Data was limited, but no repeat of the 2016 ping has been recorded. Researchers at the University of Manitoba suggested that acoustic conditions in the strait could occasionally amplify natural signals from ice collisions, creating tones that seemed structured to human ears. Another theory linked the sound to migrating bowhead whales, whose calls can sometimes reflect off the ice and sound artificial when heard from certain angles. For those who live there, the event remains part of recent memory. The hunters who first reported it still talk about how quickly the wildlife vanished, how the seals that once covered the ice disappeared, how the caribou stopped crossing the channel that season. Some say they still listen for the sound when they travel there, a reminder of the year the sea itself seemed to hum. Whatever caused it, the Arctic ping has never been recorded again. The Fury and Hecla Strait has returned to its usual stillness. Long days of cold wind, drifting ice, and the muffled quiet that comes only from miles of frozen water. But somewhere beneath that ice, the memory of a sound remains, a pulse that once echoed through one of the most remote seas on Earth, Pantelleria Vecchia Bank Monolith, Mediterranean. In the narrow sea between Sicily and Tunisia, the Mediterranean floor hides traces of a world that once stood above water. About 60 kilometers south of Sicily lies a submerged plateau called the Pantelleria Vecchia Bank, a ridge that, during the last ice age, was part of a vast coastal plain connecting Europe and North Africa. It was there, in 2015, that scientists scanning the seabed found something no one expected, a massive carved stone standing upright, nearly 10 meters long, resting 40 meters below the surface. At first, it looked like a natural formation, another block of eroded limestone common to the region. But closer inspection showed clear signs of human workmanship. The stone had 3 large holes drilled clean through it, one near each end and another at its center. Its sides were smooth, its edges deliberate. When divers measured and mapped it, they realized it was not part of the surrounding bedrock. The monolith had been quarried, cut and transported, all at least 9,500 years ago. The discovery came during a marine survey conducted by the National Institute of Oceanography and Experimental Geophysics in Trieste. Researchers were studying the geology of the Sicilian Channel when sonar images revealed a long shadow on the seabed. The structure measured nearly 12 tons in weight, too regular in shape to be accidental. When divers reached it, they found it lying in 2 large pieces, broken likely by seismic activity that later sank the plateau. Dating of nearby sediment and fossilized shells placed the site in the early Holocene, when sea levels were much lower. Around 10,000 years ago, the area was dry land, a shallow coastal plain scattered with lakes and river deltas. People lived there, hunting and gathering along the shores of a Mediterranean landscape now buried by water. The stone itself, called the Pantelleria Vecchia Bank Monolith, was made of a type of limestone not found where it now rests. That meant whoever made it had extracted it elsewhere and moved it several hundred meters, possibly using simple wooden rollers or dragging it across the ground with ropes. The precision of the holes, circular and evenly spaced, suggested knowledge of drilling techniques long before the development of metal tools. Archaeologists who examined the monolith concluded it was not a natural product of erosion. The symmetry of the holes and the uniform shape could not have been produced by underwater currents or fracture. Instead, the tool marks and alignment indicated human modification. The big question became, what was it for? Some researchers proposed that the stone served a practical function, perhaps as part of a fishing installation or anchoring system along an ancient shoreline. The holes might have held wooden poles or ropes. Others saw it as ceremonial, a standing stone or marker similar to megalithic monuments that appeared across Europe thousands of years later. Its position on the plateau, facing what would have been open sea, suggests it may have held symbolic meaning. The age of the artifact is what makes it extraordinary. If the dating is correct, the monolith predates most known examples of large-scale stoneworking in the Mediterranean by several millennia. It belongs to a time when agriculture was just beginning to spread from the Near East, and when rising sea levels were steadily drowning coastal settlements across the region. As the Ice Age glaciers melted, sea levels rose more than 100 meters worldwide. In the central Mediterranean, this submerged entire landscapes, including the now sunken Sicily Channel Bridge, a natural land link between the continents. The Pantelleria Vecchia Bank was one of those lost territories. By about 8,000 years ago, it lay underwater. Whatever people had lived there were forced inland, leaving their structures behind to vanish beneath the waves. The monolith was first photographed in high resolution using multi-beam sonar, revealing a surface smoothed by centuries of underwater erosion, but still clearly carved. The holes measure about 60 centimeters wide, tapering toward the interior, too regular to have formed naturally. In one opening, marine growth has formed a crust, proving that the stone has been underwater for thousands of years. Its context has drawn comparisons to other submerged prehistoric sites, like Pavlopetri in Greece and Atlit Yam off Israel, where ancient settlements now lie beneath shallow seas. Each hints at a time when human communities thrived on lands that no longer exist. The Pantelleria monolith may represent part of that same pattern, early human engineering that disappeared as the Mediterranean rose. No direct artifacts such as tools or bones have been found near the monolith. The seafloor around it is a mix of sand and rock, swept by currents that may have carried away lighter materials long ago. Scientists plan further dives using remotely operated vehicles to search for traces of nearby habitation, hearths, post holes, or quarry marks. If found, they could prove that organised communities inhabited the plateau far earlier than previously believed. For now, the stone stands alone in the dark water, silent, massive, and deliberate. Its edges remain sharp despite 10 millennia of submersion, its drilled holes still marking human intent. It is both artifact and mystery, a message carved into rock by people whose land, language, and purpose have long been erased by the sea. Yonaguni Monument, Japan. Off the southern coast of Japan's Ryukyu Islands, near the small island of Yonaguni, the seafloor drops suddenly into deep blue water. It is a place of strong currents and powerful tides, where hammerhead sharks glide between coral slopes. In 1986, a local diver exploring those waters came across something unusual, a massive structure rising from the seabed, shaped not like coral or volcanic rock, but like the walls and terraces of a giant staircase. At first, he thought it might be part of an ancient city. The formation stretched nearly 100 meters long and 25 meters high, with sharp edges and clean right angles that seemed too precise for nature. Blocks appeared stacked like steps. Platforms led into corridors and vertical shafts plunged into shadow. The diver's photographs spread quickly, sparking fascination and debate across Japan. When marine geologists visited the site, they confirmed the structure's scale. It was immense, a series of flat terraces, pillars, and geometric slopes carved into solid sandstone. Some surfaces were so smooth they looked chiseled. Along one side ran a set of steps leading to a large flat area nicknamed the stage. Another section formed what appeared to be a staircase connecting multiple tiers. Divers also reported triangular patterns, trenches, and rectangular holes that resembled doorways. The site sits about 25 meters below the surface at its highest point and 40 meters at its base. It covers an area comparable to a small football field. Surrounding it are scattered boulders and ridges, suggesting that the monument is part of a larger geological complex. From the moment it was discovered, two explanations emerged. The first, and most widely accepted by geologists, holds that the Yonaguni formation is entirely natural. The rock is a type of fine-grained sandstone and mudstone known as the Yonaguni subgroup, which fractures easily along horizontal and vertical planes. Over thousands of years, earthquakes, wave action, and erosion could have split the layers into angular shapes. The island itself lies on an active tectonic zone where uplift and subsidence continually reshape the seafloor. In this view, the monument's straight lines are an illusion, the product of natural fracturing patterns that mimic human architecture. The second explanation sees something more deliberate. Proponents argue that the precision of the shapes, the alignment of steps and terraces, and the symmetry of certain features suggest human modification. Among the most vocal supporters of this idea is marine geologist Masaki Kimura of the University of the Ryukyus. After years of dives and mapping, he proposed that parts of the monument may have been shaped by people who lived there before sea levels rose, around 10,000 years ago, a time when the area was dry land. Kimura identified what he described as a network of roads, paved surfaces, and stone tools near the formation. He also pointed to several smaller structures nearby that seem aligned with it. including features that resemble walls and drainage channels. He suggested the site might represent remnants of a prehistoric settlement, perhaps linked to a culture that existed in the region before the end of the last ice age. Skeptics remain unconvinced. No artifacts such as pottery, tools, or carvings have ever been recovered directly from the monument. The smooth surfaces that appear carved may simply result from the type of sandstone breaking cleanly along natural joints. Studies by Japan's National Institute of Geoscience have found no definitive evidence of quarrying or human tool marks. Still, the visual impression of the site is difficult to dismiss. When sunlight filters down through the clear Ryukyu water, the structure looks like a sunken temple. Divers describe the sensation of swimming along corridors and terraces that seem planned, their proportions almost architectural. The combination of right angles, flat planes, and layered steps evokes a design language common to ancient construction: ziggurats, pyramids, or step platforms. Sonar scans and 3D maps have revealed multiple levels of terraces descending outward from a central platform. Some divers refer to one section as the main monument, another as the gateway. Others have pointed out a series of upright stones that might once have been columns. To those who believe in human involvement, these alignments are deliberate, part of an organised layout. If the site were man-made, it would have been built during the late Pleistocene, when lower sea levels left much of the East China Sea exposed as land. That would make it one of the oldest known megalithic sites on Earth, older than the pyramids, older even than Göbekli Tepe, but proving that theory has remained impossible without datable artifacts or signs of habitation. Earthquakes frequently strike the region, occasionally loosening debris and reshaping parts of the formation. Coral growth has also begun to cover sections of the rock, preserving it but blurring finer details. The constant movement of currents and sediment makes excavation extremely difficult. Today, the Yonaguni monument is both a scientific site and a diving attraction. Marine geologists continue to map its surfaces, while divers from around the world visit to descend its steps. Some see a geological wonder, others a trace of an ancient civilization erased by the rising sea. Beneath the currents of the East China Sea, the giant terraces remain, stone platforms in perfect silence, rising from the ocean floor as if waiting for someone to explain their origin. Atlit Yam Stone Circle, Israel. Just off the northern coast of Israel, beneath the calm blue waters of the Mediterranean, lies a village frozen in time. It rests on the seabed less than a kilometre from shore, covered by layers of sand and silt. The site is known as Atlit Yam, a Neolithic settlement that sank thousands of years ago when sea levels rose. Today, it is one of the best preserved prehistoric underwater sites ever found, and at its centre stands something striking: a circle of standing stones arranged with clear, deliberate precision. Atlit Yam was discovered in 1984 by marine archaeologist Ehud Galili while surveying the seabed near the modern town of Atlit, south of Haifa. At a depth of around 10 metres, divers spotted lines of stones and the faint outline of rectangular foundations. Over time, excavations revealed an entire village: dwellings, tools, hearths, wells, and human remains. Radiocarbon dating placed it between 9,000 and 8,000 years old, a time when early farming communities were taking shape across the Levant. But what captured the attention of archaeologists most was the arrangement of 7 large stones standing upright in a semicircle. Each one was about 1.5 to 2.5 metres tall, weighing several tons. Around them lay a shallow oval basin carved into the seabed rock. The stones had been placed with care, forming what appeared to be a ceremonial or communal area. Some of the megaliths bore shallow cut marks, carved depressions that may once have held offerings or symbolic objects. The orientation of the stones is thought to have been intentional. They stand in a pattern that might have aligned with solar or lunar cycles, though the evidence is incomplete. Archaeologists working at the site found traces of freshwater springs nearby, leading to one of the leading theories: that the stone circle was part of a water-related ritual or a shrine dedicated to fertility and the life-giving properties of water. At the time the village was inhabited, the shoreline was several hundred metres farther out, and these springs would have been vital to the settlement's survival. Around the circle, researchers discovered additional structures that revealed how advanced the community had been. Rectangular houses built from uncut stone, complete with floors and hearths, grinding stones used for processing cereals and legumes, Animal bones and plant remains showed a mixed economy. People hunted and fished but also cultivated crops. In one of the wells, they found layers of freshwater shells, suggesting that residents deliberately sealed it after it became brackish due to rising sea levels. The preservation of Atlit Yam is remarkable because it was sealed by the sea rather than destroyed. As the last ice age ended, melting glaciers caused global sea levels to rise more than 60 meters. The low-lying coastal plains of the eastern Mediterranean gradually flooded. Instead of being eroded, the village was slowly submerged, locking organic material in oxygen-poor layers of silt. Wooden artifacts, seeds, and even human skeletons survived almost intact. Among the remains found were 10 human burials, including a woman and child buried together. Analysis of their bones revealed signs of tuberculosis, making them among the earliest known cases of the disease in human history. The finding offered a rare glimpse into early human health and community care, evidence that these were not transient hunter-gatherers, but settled people living in organised groups. The stone circle remains the most enigmatic feature. Its smooth surfaces and intentional arrangement suggest more than simple construction. Some scholars compare it to early megalithic structures in Europe, like those at Göbekli Tepe or Stonehenge, though Atlit Yam predates both by several thousand years. Its existence shows that long before monumental architecture rose on land, humans were already shaping stones in meaningful ways. Marine archaeologists studying the site used 3D photogrammetry and side-scan sonar to reconstruct the settlement digitally. The circle, when mapped in high resolution, appears almost symmetrical, with 2 larger stones marking the ends of the arc. One hypothesis is that it formed part of a communal gathering space, a place for ceremonies, seasonal observances, or perhaps mourning rituals. Others think it could have served a practical role related to the nearby springs, maybe as a water control or purification area. Because the stones rest on bedrock rather than being buried in sediment, some experts believe they were anchored to prevent shifting during seasonal floods, a sign of deliberate engineering. The holes and cup marks carved into their surfaces may have been used to hold wooden beams or ritual vessels. Whatever the function, the arrangement reveals a shared effort, coordination, planning, and a symbolic understanding of space. To swim among the stones today is to move through a landscape that once echoed with voices, firelight, and the sounds of early farming life. The seabed around them still holds the remnants of nets and fishing weights, reminders that these people balanced land cultivation with the resources of the sea. Their world changed when the waters rose, swallowing their fields, homes, and shrines. Now the Atlit Yam stone circle stands in the quiet of the Mediterranean depths, surrounded by sand, seaweed, and fish drifting through gaps once filled with human hands. It remains a rare glimpse into the earliest human attempts to shape meaning from the natural world, a circle of stones standing silently in a world that has long since passed away. Jian Sang, 2006, Gulf of Carpentaria. In early 2006, an Australian coastwatch plane was flying a routine patrol over the remote waters of the Gulf of Carpentaria, a vast shallow bay separating Queensland from the Northern Territory. The sea below was calm that day, empty except for one slow-moving shape drifting aimlessly across the blue. From the air, it looked like a large cargo vessel, but something about it was wrong. No wake, no movement on deck, no radio signal, just a rust-coloured tanker adrift in silence. When maritime authorities reached the site by patrol boat, they found a 100-metre-long ship floating low in the water. The name painted on the stern read Jian Sang, though the letters were faded and uneven. No crew appeared on deck. The boarding party circled her twice before climbing up a hanging rope ladder that swung loosely in the wind. The decks were deserted. Inside, the ship was eerily intact but lifeless. Tables stood covered in dust, galley utensils lay scattered, and the engine room was quiet except for the groaning of corroded metal. There were no signs of struggle or fire. No personal belongings, no paperwork, not even a single document that might identify who had owned or operated her. Every identifying plaque and serial number had been carefully removed, scraped clean with tools. Investigators searched the bridge for a logbook. It was gone. The radio had been dismantled. The navigation computer and engine controls were inoperable. In one storage compartment, they found large bundles of rice sacks still sealed. Apart from that, the ship carried no cargo. The holds were empty, the fuel tanks nearly dry. Officials towed the vessel toward Waipar on the western coast of Cape York Peninsula and began a full inspection. The hull markings indicated she had once been an oil products tanker, likely of Chinese construction, about 30 years old. Her flag had been removed, and the International Maritime Organization number, a unique ID etched on every legitimate vessel, had been ground off the steel. It was as if someone had tried to erase her entire history. The first theory was abandonment. Ghost ships are not unheard of in Southeast Asian waters. Aging vessels often change hands in grey markets and are stripped for scrap or used in illicit fuel transfers. The Jian Sang may have been part of that network, an old tanker sold repeatedly until she was no longer seaworthy. If her engines failed mid-transfer, her crew could have been rescued by another vessel and left her to drift. But this explanation raised new questions. Why remove every identification mark? Why leave behind sacks of rice but no tools, radios or fuel? Authorities examined satellite imagery and shipping records. No recent transmission matched the Jian Sang's last known coordinates. There were no distress calls, and no shipping company reported a missing tanker of her size. Her paint scheme didn't correspond to any active registry. Even her name appeared to be a decoy. The characters loosely translated to strong and healthy ship, a generic phrase often used on low-cost bulk carriers. Australian customs agents scoured the interior for clues. In the engine room, they found evidence of crude welding and patch repairs, signs that she'd been kept running despite severe mechanical problems. The bilges were thick with oil residue. Her anchor chains were coated in barnacles, suggesting she had been adrift for months. Yet, strangely, her mooring lines were fresh, as if someone had tied her off recently. Speculation turned towards smuggling. Some believed the tanker was a supply ship used to refuel fishing fleets or transport contraband across the region. The rice on board could have been payment or trade goods, but without a crew, manifest or radio logs, there was no proof. The hull contained no hidden compartments, no drugs, no weapons, just an empty vessel drifting hundreds of kilometers from any known shipping route. The Gulf of Carpentaria is shallow and bordered by reefs, making navigation hazardous for large ships. The fact that the Jian Sang survived there for so long without running aground added to the mystery. Tides and monsoon winds likely carried her slowly in circles until she was spotted. After a week of inspection, authorities determined that she posed an environmental risk. The hull was leaking oil and towing her to port would be dangerous. The Australian government decided to scuttle the vessel at sea. On April 21, 2006, after collecting all evidence of value, the Jian Sang was towed beyond the continental shelf and deliberately sunk with controlled charges. She went down in deep water, leaving only photographs, sonar scans and questions. In the months that followed, maritime investigators traced ship registries across Asia, hoping to link the Jian Sang to a decommissioned tanker or ghost fleet entry. Nothing matched. Several vessels with similar tonnage and design were examined, but all had different deck configurations. The conclusion, filed quietly in government records, stated only that the ship's ownership and origin were unknown. For years, the Jian Sang remained an example used by the Australian Maritime Safety Authority to highlight illegal ship-breaking and flag hopping, the practice of disguising vessel identities to avoid regulation. But even within those patterns, her story stood out. She'd carried no cargo worth stealing, and whoever stripped her ID had taken remarkable care to erase her past. No one has ever claimed her. No insurance company, no shipping registry, no former crew. All that remains is the record of a nameless tanker found drifting quietly in an empty gulf, its engines cold, its purpose forgotten, its identity lost somewhere in the paperless maze of the world's oceans. SS Marine Sulfur Queen, 1963, Straits of Florida. On February 4, 1963, the 524-foot tanker Marine Sulfur Queen sailed out of Beaumont, Texas, into the Gulf of Mexico. Her destination was Norfolk, Virginia. On board were 39 men and a full load of molten sulfur, more than 15,000 tons of it, carried at a temperature of over 260 degrees Celsius in 4 long insulated tanks. It would be her final voyage. The ship was a converted T2 oil tanker, a World War II-era design that had once transported fuel for the US Navy. In 1960, her owners, Marine Transport Lines, had retrofitted her to carry liquefied sulfur, a material far more corrosive and unpredictable than oil. The conversion involved cutting the original cargo space into giant containment chambers, lined with steel and asbestos. Though engineers approved the design, inspectors noted structural fatigue in the hull even before the retrofit was complete. At 12:50 a.m. on February 4th, she left port under the command of Captain Benjamin Worley. The weather was calm and nothing unusual appeared in her final radio messages. The next day, the Coast Guard received a single, faint signal believed to be from her position near the Florida Straits. And then, silence. She never arrived in Norfolk. When the Marine Sulfur Queen failed to report as scheduled, search and rescue operations began immediately. The Coast Guard dispatched aircraft and cutters across thousands of square miles between the Dry Tortugas and Key West. After several days, they found debris, bits of life preservers, nameboards, and oil drums floating near the Florida coast. One of the recovered life rings bore the ship's name. Another piece of wreckage was a section of charred insulation from the sulfur tanks. No survivors were ever found. The investigation that followed became one of the most extensive maritime inquiries of its time. The Coast Guard analysed the recovered material, weather data, and ship records to determine what could have caused such a complete disappearance. They identified several possible failure modes, none definitive. One leading theory was structural failure. The Marine Sulfur Queen had shown signs of metal fatigue along her midsection, where the hull flexed under heavy load. The conversion to sulfur transport had altered her balance, concentrating weight where the original design had not intended. In rough seas, this stress could have caused her to crack in two, a fate that had already claimed several aging T2 tankers during the 1950s. If she'd broken suddenly, her molten sulfur cargo could have ignited or exploded upon contact with seawater. But there was no record of a distress call or explosion heard by other ships in the area. The weather was moderate, scattered squalls, nothing severe enough to tear apart a vessel of her size. Another possibility involved her cargo itself. Molten sulfur, when exposed to moisture or oxygen, can create flammable gases such as hydrogen sulfide. The tanks, if cracked or improperly vented, might have allowed a build-up of pressure or gas pockets. Even a small leak could lead to a violent reaction or suffocation of the crew. The Coast Guard noted that sulfur residue found on the wreck fragments showed signs of intense heat, though they couldn't determine if it was from a fire or prolonged exposure to high-temperature cargo. There was also speculation about the ship's design. The conversion process had removed much of the internal bracing that oil tankers rely on for stability. Engineers later suggested that the Marine Sulfur Queen might have been longitudinally weak, meaning the hull could twist or flex excessively during motion. Once a crack formed, it could propagate rapidly, snapping the vessel in two. If that occurred in the middle of the night, the ship could have gone down in minutes, leaving the crew no time to respond. The Coast Guard's final report, released in 1964, did not assign a single cause. Instead, it listed multiple contributing factors: structural weakness, improper design for the new cargo, potential corrosion from sulfur, and lack of safety venting systems. They concluded that the vessel was in an unseaworthy condition when she departed from Beaumont, and that the loss was probably due to structural failure of the ship while in operation. Still, probably was as far as they could go. No wreckage large enough to identify the ship's remains was ever found. The Gulf Stream may have carried debris far out into the Atlantic before dispersing it completely. Later sonar searches in the 1970s and 1980s failed to locate any trace on the seafloor. Over time, the Marine Sulfur Queen became part of the lore surrounding the so-called Bermuda Triangle, though the Coast Guard and National Transportation Safety Board never supported that narrative. They viewed it purely as an engineering and safety failure, a warning about the dangers of retrofitting old ships for new purposes without fully understanding the consequences. The ship's loss led to changes in maritime regulations for hazardous cargo. New tankers were required to have specialised containment systems and independent venting for reactive substances like molten sulfur. But for the families of the 39 men aboard, the official findings offered little comfort. Without a wreck or a single recovered body, the Marine Sulfur Queen remains one of the most complete disappearances in American maritime history. A steel giant that left port in calm weather and vanished somewhere between the Gulf of Mexico and the Florida Straits without a trace of what really happened on that final night. Soviet sub K-129 1968 N Pacific and Project Azorian Recovery 1974. In the early hours of March 8, 1968, deep beneath the cold waters of the North Pacific, a Soviet ballistic missile submarine known as K-129 disappeared without a signal. It was part of the Pacific Fleet based in Kamchatka, and it carried 3 nuclear missiles capable of striking targets thousands of miles away. Its last known position was somewhere north of Hawaii, a silent patrol that ended without a trace. For weeks, the Soviet Navy searched the ocean, deploying dozens of ships and aircraft. No distress call had been received. No debris was sighted. The loss was considered classified, but within military circles, the silence of K-129 became a matter of growing alarm. Then, on the other side of the Pacific, US Naval Listening Post detected something unusual. A low-frequency acoustic event recorded by an underwater monitoring system designed to track submarines and nuclear tests. The signal pointed to one specific patch of ocean, more than 5,000 meters deep. In the summer of that same year, the US Navy's deep-sea reconnaissance ship USNS Mizar was quietly sent to the coordinates. Using sensitive sonar equipment, the crew mapped a disturbance on the seabed. There, nearly 3 miles down, lay the shattered remains of a submarine. The dimensions and outline matched those of the missing K-129. What caused her to sink was unclear, but the wreck appeared largely intact. For Washington, the discovery presented a unique opportunity. The Cold War was at its height, and a lost Soviet ballistic missile submarine resting in international waters meant access to nuclear technology, code books, and potentially encrypted communication systems. In secret, the US government approved one of the most ambitious covert engineering operations in history, Project Azorian. Planned and executed by the CIA between 1970 and 1974, Project Azorian aimed to raise the wreck of K-129 from a depth of over 16,000 feet, something never attempted before. To maintain secrecy, the CIA needed a public cover story. They partnered with billionaire Howard Hughes, whose name was already associated with unconventional ventures. Under his company's banner, the US commissioned a massive vessel, the Glomar Explorer, officially described as a deep-sea mining ship designed to collect manganese nodules from the ocean floor. In reality, the Glomar Explorer was built for one purpose: to lift a Soviet submarine from the abyss. Hidden beneath its hull was an enormous mechanical claw, the capture vehicle, designed to descend, grasp the wreck, and haul it into a sealed recovery bay, all while preventing Soviet ships from realizing what was happening. By July 1974, the operation began in the target zone. Soviet vessels, noticing the massive American ship lingering in the area, sent patrols to observe, but the cover story held. For weeks, the Glomar Explorer stayed in position as the claw descended 5,000 meters to the seabed. Engineers guided it toward the wreck, latched onto part of the submarine's hull, and began the slow process of raising it toward the surface. Halfway up, something went wrong. Sensors indicated a mechanical failure. One of the claw's sections had fractured under the strain. As the ship's crew watched helplessly, most of the submarine broke loose and fell back into the depths. Only a small forward section remained secured in the capture vehicle. That fragment, weighing several hundred tons, was successfully brought into the ship's containment bay. Inside were 2 nuclear torpedoes, sonar equipment, and the remains of several Soviet sailors. According to declassified US documents, the crew held a brief formal burial at sea for the recovered bodies, recorded on film and later provided to the Russian government decades afterward. The salvage portion was carefully examined for technical data, but it represented only a fraction of what the CIA had hoped to recover. The secrecy around Project Azorian was extraordinary. The operation cost hundreds of millions of dollars, equivalent to billions today, and involved over 1,000 personnel sworn to silence. The first leaks about it appeared in 1975 when journalists learned of the project, leading to the now famous CIA response. "We can neither confirm nor deny." That phrase, the Glomar response, entered public lexicon as the agency's standard line for classified matters. As for K-129, her final moments remain one of the great unsolved mysteries of submarine history. The official Soviet explanation listed her as lost due to an accident. Some US analysts suggested a catastrophic explosion in the missile compartment. Others believed she suffered an internal mechanical failure, perhaps a battery explosion or hydrogen leak, that caused a rapid descent. Still others speculated about a collision with an American submarine, though no definitive evidence supports that claim. Years later, when the Soviet Union collapsed and archives partially opened, no new documents surfaced to clarify the cause. The crew's final transmission remains unknown. The ship's logbook was never recovered. Even the precise coordinates of the wreck are still classified. What is known is that K-129 rests in one of the deepest parts of the Pacific, scattered across the ocean floor. The CIA's partial recovery in 1974 remains the only confirmed instance of a deep ocean operation of that magnitude. A Cold War story of technology, secrecy and loss, centered on a submarine that vanished without a word and the world's quietest effort to bring it back. USS Proteius and USS Nereus, 1941. In the final months of 1941, as the world braced for the full force of war, 2 American naval colliers, ships built to carry coal for the fleet, vanished without a trace in the Atlantic Ocean. They were sister ships, the USS Proteius and the USS Nereus, both built in the early 20th century and later converted for cargo use. Within weeks of each other, both vessels disappeared while transporting bauxite, the ore used to produce aluminum, from the Caribbean to North America. Neither left a distress call. Neither was ever found. The Proteius had been launched in 1912, followed a year later by her sister Nereus. Each measured nearly 530 feet long, with steel hulls and triple expansion steam engines. During World War I, they served as colliers for the US Navy, supplying coal to warships and bases abroad. In the interwar years, both were transferred to the US Maritime Commission and eventually operated by the Aluminum Company of Canada, carrying bauxite between ports in the Caribbean and the Canadian Maritimes. By the end of 1941, the Atlantic was one of the most dangerous seas on Earth. German U-boats prowled the shipping lanes, attacking merchant vessels in what would later be called the Battle of the Atlantic. The Proteius and Nereus were unarmed and unescorted, slow-moving cargo ships travelling through waters that had already claimed hundreds of lives. The Proteius departed St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands in late November 1941, loaded with thousands of tons of bauxite bound for Newfoundland. She was last seen leaving port on November 23rd. Her course would have taken her northeast, across open waters toward Bermuda, and then north into the cold Atlantic. She never arrived. Only weeks later, the Nereus followed almost the same route, leaving St. Thomas in early December with a similar cargo and destination. She too vanished somewhere along that same stretch of sea. No debris, no oil slicks, and no survivors were ever found. The timing and similarity of the losses led to speculation almost immediately. Some believed both ships had been torpedoed by German submarines operating in the Western Atlantic, but post-war records from the Kriegsmarine revealed no U-boat claims corresponding to either ship. No German submarine reported sinking a large American collier in that region at that time. The US Navy's own review after the war confirmed the absence of any matching attack. That left other possibilities: mechanical failure, storm, or catastrophic structural collapse. The Proteius and Nereus had already served 3 decades of heavy duty by the time they vanished. Designed as colliers, not ore carriers, their hulls were long and flexible, and their holds were modified to accommodate bauxite, a dense, heavy material that exerts enormous stress on a ship's frame. Overloading or uneven distribution of weight could cause a hull to buckle in rough seas. In both cases, the ships were last reported in fair weather, though the North Atlantic is known for sudden squalls and rogue waves. The Proteius was believed to have been near the Bermuda region when contact was lost, while the Nereus disappeared somewhere farther north along the same corridor. With no distress call and no debris, some speculated they might have suffered a rapid breakup, the kind of structural failure that leaves no time for escape. The loss of 2 nearly identical vessels, carrying the same cargo along nearly identical routes within weeks of each other, became one of the most perplexing maritime mysteries of World War II. For years afterward, mariners whispered about the Proteius-class disappearances, which also included the Cyclops, another US Navy collier of the same design that vanished in 1918, also carrying a load of ore. Together, the 3 ships, Cyclops, Proteius, and Nereus, all disappeared in roughly the same broad region of the Atlantic, all without a trace. Later, some theorized that the bauxite cargo might have played a role. When mixed with moisture, it can shift suddenly during rough weather, destabilizing a ship and causing it to list or capsize. Others proposed that the density of the cargo placed too much strain on the hull's midsection, particularly if the ships encountered heavy seas head-on. Without internal reinforcement, a sudden snap amidships could have split the vessel in two, sending it down in minutes. Over the decades, expeditions have searched sections of the seafloor for wreckage, but none of the ships have ever been located. Their depth, likely thousands of meters, and the lack of precise coordinates make recovery almost impossible. Unlike warships with known battle records, these merchant colliers vanished on routine voyages, leaving no witnesses and no transmissions to pinpoint their final hours. Naval historians often group their disappearances together as examples of the dangers of aging hulls pushed beyond their design limits during wartime demand. The Proteius and Nereus were workhorses, reliable in their time, but never built for the stresses of carrying compact ore across an unpredictable ocean. By the time they left St. Thomas, both were already overdue for major refits that wartime production schedules never allowed. The records list them simply as lost with all hands. 39 men aboard Proteius, 61 aboard Nereus. 2 ships gone in less than a month, without a signal, without a survivor, without a wreck to tell their story. Somewhere in the North Atlantic, beneath miles of cold, dark water, their steel hulls may still lie side by side, reminders of how quickly the sea can erase even the largest machines built to master it. HIAM 6, 2002 Indian Ocean. In early January 2002, an Australian Coastwatch aircraft patrolling the waters off the country's northwest coast spotted something drifting. A small fishing vessel, its bow pointed aimlessly into the Indian Ocean. The sea was calm, but the ship appeared unmanned. When officers later boarded the vessel, they found its name painted in black across the hull, HIAM 6. Inside, there were no signs of struggle. The lights still worked. The galley was stocked with food. Fuel tanks were full, but not a single person was aboard. The HIAM 6 was a longline fishing boat registered in Taiwan, 20 meters long and designed for deep-sea tuna fishing. She had left the port of Suao in October 2002, with a crew of 10 Indonesians and a Taiwanese captain named Chen Taiqing. Her course was toward the fishing grounds of the South Pacific, but sometime after departure, communication with her owners abruptly ceased. No distress calls were received. No one reported seeing her for months, until she turned up thousands of kilometers away, adrift near the remote Australian territory of Christmas Island. When Australian maritime authorities approached the vessel, they expected to find a dead engine or evidence of piracy. Instead, the HIAM 6 was in surprisingly good condition. The engine room was intact, the refrigeration system was running, and the ship carried a full load of fuel and supplies. The radio and navigation systems were operational. In the captain's cabin, clothes hung neatly, and a logbook was open on the desk. The date of the last entry was November 5th, 2002. What struck investigators was how abruptly the crew had vanished. Coffee cups and utensils were still laid out in the galley, as if the men had left in the middle of a meal. Fishing lines trailed behind the stern, and baited hooks floated in the water. There were no signs of a fight. No blood, no broken furniture, no bullet holes. Everything appeared in order, except for the absence of people. A search of the vessel revealed passports, documents, and personal belongings belonging to the crew. Lifeboats and life jackets were still on board. The only thing missing were the crew's identification papers and their satellite phone. That detail led investigators to suspect the men had left intentionally, or had been forced to leave by someone among them. The ship was towed to the port of Broome, Western Australia, where police and the Taiwanese Fisheries Agency began a joint investigation. Early reports ruled out mechanical failure. The vessel was seaworthy, and the weather in that region had been stable during the time of disappearance. The most plausible scenario, authorities believed, was mutiny. Within weeks, an Indonesian crewman from the HIAM 6 was found alive in a village on the island of Sulawesi. When questioned by Indonesian police, he admitted that the crew had mutinied while at sea. According to his account, they had killed the captain and the engineer, then set a course toward Indonesia before abandoning the vessel. He claimed he had escaped the others during their return to land. His story raised more questions than it answered. Authorities were never able to locate the other crew members, and no bodies were ever recovered. Investigators found no physical evidence of violence on the ship, no traces of blood, no weapons, and no damage consistent with a struggle. The deck and cabins were remarkably clean. The Indonesian government later stated that without corroborating witnesses or evidence, The man's confession couldn't be verified. The High M6 itself became a drifting enigma. With her engines intact and systems functioning, she'd continued to drift for weeks after being abandoned, carried by the ocean's currents across vast distances. Analysis of her fuel consumption and drift pattern suggested that she'd likely been deserted near Indonesia's northern waters and had floated south for over a month before being spotted near Australia. Some speculated that the mutiny story might have been true but incomplete, that the crew panicked after killing their superiors and fled in smaller boats only to perish at sea. Others wondered whether the crew had been victims themselves, perhaps targeted by pirates or smugglers in the region who left the ship intact to avoid detection. The area is known for occasional illegal fishing operations and human trafficking routes, where ships sometimes operate under false ownership. Another mystery lay in the ship's cargo. The High Aim 6 was carrying preserved bait, fuel and equipment, but no catch. If the vessel had been active for over a month before being found, she should have contained some fish. Investigators considered whether she might have been used for something other than fishing, smuggling perhaps, but no contraband was found. The Taiwanese Fisheries Agency officially recorded the vessel as abandoned crew missing, with cause unknown. The owner of the High Aim 6 never recovered her. After inspection, the Australian authorities declared her unfit for use, and she was eventually scrapped. Years later, the case is still cited among modern maritime mysteries, not for the ship's condition, but for the eerie normalcy it preserved. A vessel found under power, food on the table, and no trace of its people. Somewhere between Taiwan and Australia, a crew disappeared into the endless blue, leaving behind a ship that, for weeks, sailed without them. Taiqing 21 2008 Pacific. On November 9, 2008, a Royal Air Force patrol plane spotted a large fishing vessel drifting aimlessly in the Pacific Ocean, about 1,000 kilometers south of Kiribati. From the air, the ship appeared burned, blackened streaks across the deck, the hull scarred by fire. No movement was visible. The name on the bow read Taiqing 21, a Taiwanese longliner. There were no signs of life. When investigators from Taiwan's Fisheries Agency and US Coast Guard vessels reached the scene days later, they found the ship abandoned. The Taiqing 21 had suffered extensive fire damage, but her hull was still afloat. The decks were charred, the bridge partially collapsed, and the interior reeked of smoke. The engines were off. Lifeboats were gone. No distress signal had ever been sent. The Taiqing 21 was a 70-ton tuna fishing vessel registered in Taiwan and operated out of Majuro in the Marshall Islands. It carried a multinational crew of 29, including the Taiwanese captain, engineer, and 27 fishermen from China, Indonesia, and the Philippines. The ship had last made radio contact on October 28th, about 12 days before it was discovered adrift. After that, silence. Investigators who boarded the vessel were met with a grim scene. Burned wiring and melted equipment hung from the walls. The galley was destroyed, the sleeping quarters blackened, but despite the destruction, the fire appeared to have been contained to the upper decks. Below, the engine room and fuel tanks were intact, suggesting the blaze had not started from mechanical failure. There were no signs of an explosion, no impact holes, no hull breaches. Whatever happened had burned from above, fast and fierce, but not enough to sink her. The absence of life-saving equipment told its own story. Every lifeboat and emergency raft was missing. So were the crew's personal effects, passports, clothing and tools. Yet oddly, the fishing gear, winches and longline reels were still in place. It was as if the crew had left in a hurry, but taken only the most basic items with them. The investigation began with the few clues that remained. The ship's logbook had been destroyed in the fire, but radio logs indicated no distress call was made after October 28th. The Automatic Identification System, or AIS, was disabled. Analysis of currents and wind suggested the vessel had drifted for over a week before being spotted. One of the first questions was whether the fire had started accidentally. On fishing vessels like the Taiqing 21, electrical wiring, cooking stoves and stored fuel create constant hazards. But experienced crews are trained to contain such blazes quickly. The burned areas showed signs of intentional ignition, multiple start points across different decks. That led authorities to consider sabotage or mutiny. The Taiqing 21 operated in one of the world's most remote fishing zones. where oversight is minimal and tensions often run high. Life aboard longliners can be brutal: long shifts, isolation, and little pay. Conflicts between crew and officers are not uncommon. Some speculated that the fire might have been an act of revenge or desperation. Others suggested that it was an attempt to cover evidence of violence. Search aircraft and ships scoured more than 21,000 square miles of ocean around the drifting vessel. Not a single life raft, body, or piece of debris was found. Satellite analysis showed no other ships in the area during the time window of the disappearance. The crew had vanished completely. Piracy was another possibility. Although rare in that part of the Pacific, instances of violent theft and forced labour are known in illegal fishing networks. The Taiqing 21 could have been intercepted by another vessel, the crew abducted or killed, and the ship torched afterward to erase traces. Yet no evidence of robbery was found. The ship's valuable fishing gear and fuel remained untouched. Investigators from Taiwan, Kiribati, and the United States reviewed radio records, hoping to locate any emergency transmission or signal reflection from the Taiqing 21. None were detected. The vessel's distress beacon, an emergency position indicating radio beacon, or EPIRB, was missing, suggesting it may have been taken intentionally or destroyed before it could activate. In the weeks following the discovery, the search for survivors expanded toward the Marshall Islands and Tuvalu. Fishing vessels passing through that region were asked to keep watch for life rafts or wreckage. Nothing surfaced. The Pacific's vastness, combined with strong currents, made survival unlikely after so many days at sea. When the inquiry concluded, the official report listed the cause of the incident as unknown. Fire origin undetermined, crew unlocated, vessel abandoned. The Taiqing 21 was later towed to port and dismantled, leaving behind a handful of photographs and reports, the only records of one of the strangest maritime disappearances of the 21st century. Theories persist. Some maritime experts believe the crew abandoned ship after the fire, only to become lost at sea. Others suspect deliberate foul play, perhaps a mutiny or insurance fraud disguised as an accident. Taiwanese maritime investigators noted that the vessel's communication systems had been manually shut off before the blaze, indicating premeditation. But with no survivors and no bodies, the truth has never been proven. All that remains are the facts. A modern fishing vessel found scorched and empty, its crew vanished, its distress systems silenced. For days, the Taiqing 21 drifted alone through one of the most isolated stretches of ocean on Earth, a silent witness to something that happened far beyond the reach of rescue or record. Centuries of exploration haven't changed one simple truth. The sea keeps its secrets. From ghost ships to lost submarines and ancient ruins beneath the waves, some answers remain beyond reach. The ocean gives fragments, not closure, and that is why its mysteries never fade.